The front desk asked who I was talking to at 3 a.m. The call was placed from my room while I was asleep. The voicemail was from the front desk. I noticed it when I picked up my phone to check the time. 7:52 a.m. The gray, flat light of a November morning pressing through the gap in the curtains. I'd been in the hotel 3 nights by then. The Hargrove, a mid-range business property outside of Columbus, the kind of place that smells like carpet cleaner and recycled air, and has a breakfast buffet that runs until 9. Nothing remarkable about it. I'd stayed in 20 hotels exactly like it in the past 2 years. I almost didn't listen to the voicemail. Almost. "Hi, this is Donna at the front desk. Just a courtesy call for the guest in room 318. We had a brief complaint from the room next door regarding noise around 3 a.m. I did try to call up to the room, but there was no answer. Just wanted to check in. Have a great morning." I sat on the edge of the bed and played it again. Noise complaint. 3 in the morning. Room 318. My room. I looked at the nightstand, at the half-empty glass of water I'd put there before bed, at the book I'd been reading face down since Tuesday. I looked at the window, still closed, locked, curtains exactly as I'd drawn them the night before. I looked at the door, chain on, deadbolt thrown. Here is what I knew with complete certainty. I had been asleep by 10:30. I'd taken a melatonin at 10 because the time zone shift was messing with me. Poured a glass of water, read maybe 8 pages, and been out before 11. I am not a light sleeper. I am not a sleepwalker. In 38 years, I have never once done anything in my sleep that could be described as a noise complaint. I showered, got dressed, told myself it was a mistake. Wrong room number, sound traveling through walls. Donna at the front desk had simply gotten confused. By the time I got down to the lobby, I had the whole thing explained away. I'm an engineer. Explaining things away is something I'm professionally trained to do. Donna was a woman in her 50s, with a neat gray bun and the specific brand of tired that comes from the overnight into morning shift. She smiled when I gave her my room number, but the smile had a question behind it. "Glad you came down, actually," she said. "I wasn't sure if I should call again. I just got your voicemail. I think there might have been a mix-up. I was asleep by 11. I couldn't have been making noise at 3. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at her computer screen. "The noise complaint, that was actually secondary," she said. "The reason I called the room first was because of the outgoing call. I waited. At 3:07 a.m., a call was placed from your room's landline to the front desk." She turned the monitor slightly so I could see the log, a column of timestamps and room numbers. My room. 3:07 a.m. Duration, 11 minutes. Whoever called didn't speak, or at least not to us. We could hear sound on the line, talking maybe, or a TV. My colleague who took the call said it sounded like a conversation, but when she spoke, no one answered. She paused. "We assumed you'd pocket-dialed, maybe fallen asleep with the receiver off the hook. But when she called back up to the room to check, there was no answer. That's when the neighbor knocked on our line about the noise. 11 minutes. I looked at the timestamp in the log. 3:07 to 3:18 a.m. I had been in that room, asleep, or so I believed. And from the landline on my nightstand, the phone I had not touched once in 3 days, someone had called the front desk and held the line open for 11 minutes while a woman on the other end said hello into the receiver and got nothing back. "I didn't make that call," I said. Donna looked at me with a careful expression of someone who has learned in 20 years of hotel work not to react too quickly to anything a guest tells her. "No," she said quietly. "I didn't think you did." I went back to the room. That was the logical thing to do. Go back, look at it properly in daylight, with fresh eyes and a clear head. I am the kind of person who believes that most problems have a mundane explanation if you're willing to do the work of finding it. A stuck key mechanism, a faulty keycard system, a glitch in the hotel's phone log that attributed someone else's call to my room number. These things happen. Technology fails in boring, administrative ways all the time. I rode the elevator to the 3rd floor and walked the corridor to 318 and let myself in. The room was exactly as I'd left it. Bed unmade. I'd gotten up and gone straight downstairs, so the sheets were still pushed back on my side, pillow dented. Glass of water on the nightstand, book face down, the spine cracked at page 94 where I'd dropped off, laptop closed on the desk, my suitcase open on the luggage rack, clothes folded in the particular way I fold them when I'm traveling alone and no one else is watching. Nothing out of place, nothing moved. I stood in the center of the room and turned slowly. Took inventory. Bathroom door open the way I'd left it. I never sleep with it closed, an old habit from childhood I've never bothered questioning. Curtains drawn. Climate control unit humming on the wall below the window. The low mechanical drone that had been the white noise of 3 nights of sleep. TV off. Remote on the desk where I'd set it the first evening and not touched since. The landline. It sat on the nightstand, on the far side from where I slept. An ordinary hotel phone, beige, push button. I crossed the room and looked at it without picking it up. The receiver was seated, fully, cleanly seated in its cradle. Not askew, not partially lifted. Settled the way something settles when it has been placed deliberately. If I had knocked it off the hook in my sleep, rolled over and hit it with an arm, even sat up and replaced it blearily without waking, it would not look like this. It would look handled, slightly wrong, the cord may be twisted. This looked like someone had finished using it and put it back carefully. I sat on the edge of the bed, thought. The room had a chain lock and a deadbolt. I'd thrown both, as I did every night in every hotel. A practice so automatic I barely registered doing it anymore. The chain, especially. You can't engage the chain from outside the room. That is the entire point of a chain lock. If the chain had been on when I woke up, which it had been, then no one had entered after I locked it, which meant either the call came from a phone system malfunction, or someone had been in the room before I locked up for the night, and I had not known it. I sat with that for a while. Let the climate control hum around me. Check-in had been Tuesday at 4. I'd come straight from a long day of site visits, dropped my bag, taken a shower, ordered room service. I'd been in and out of the room over 3 days. Meetings in the morning, back for lunch sometimes, out again, back in the evening. The door had been serviced, my trash emptied, bed made, the particular intrusion of housekeeping that you stop noticing after the first day. I had not thought carefully about whether the room was exactly as I'd left it each time I returned, because why would I? It's a hotel. People come in. That's what hotels are. I picked up the landline receiver and listened to the dial tone. Perfectly ordinary. I set it back down. Then I went and knocked on the door of room 316. He answered on the second knock, a man somewhere in his 60s, the compact, unhurried bearing of someone long retired, wearing a fleece vest at 8 in the morning like it was the most natural thing in the world. He looked at me and waited. "Hi, I'm next door, 318. I got a message from the front desk about a noise complaint. I wanted to apologize and also ask what you actually heard, because I was asleep and I'm a little confused about what happened." He looked at me for a moment with the appraising patience of someone who has outlived the need to be polite before he's ready to be. "Wasn't a noise complaint exactly," he said. "More like a concern." "Okay." Woke up around 3, heard talking through the wall. He gestured in the direction of my room. "Clear enough, I thought you had company. Didn't think much of it, tried to go back to sleep. But it went on a while. Same voice, mostly, like one side of a phone call, low, sort of." He paused. It wasn't really the noise that bothered me. It was when it stopped. I waited. Stopped all at once. Then about 20 minutes later, I heard, I don't know how to describe it. Movement, I suppose. Not like pacing, more like someone crossing a room who didn't want to be heard. Slow, deliberate. He looked at me steadily. I've been in enough situations in my life to know the difference between a person moving normally and a person trying not to make sound. That's when I called the desk. I stood in the corridor outside his door, and the fluorescent light above me buzzed very slightly, and the ice machine at the end of the hall kicked on with a deep mechanical shudder. Far away, an elevator opened and closed. "You heard someone talking," I said. "In my room. At 3 in the morning. One side of it, like I said, couldn't make out words. I was asleep," I said. "I wasn't on the phone." He looked at me with an expression I have thought about many times since. Not disbelief, exactly. More like the look of someone who understands that what he's about to say is not going to be easy to absorb, and is deciding how directly to say it. "I know," he said. "That's what concerned me." I thanked him and went back to my room. Sat at the desk this time, not the bed. Opened my laptop and stared at the screen without seeing it for a while. Outside the window, Columbus went about its business under flat November cloud. Traffic, a parking structure, the smudged outline of an overpass in the middle distance. Ordinary, indifferent, no help at all. Here is what the evidence said, stripped of the explanations I kept reaching for. At 3:07 a.m., the landline in my room had been used to call the front desk. The call had lasted 11 minutes. During those 11 minutes, someone had been talking, one-sided, low, not directed at the front desk, but audible through the wall to the man sleeping next door. Then the call had ended, and whoever placed it had moved across my room slowly, in the dark, in deliberate silence, while I slept 6 feet away. I had been in that room. I'm 38 years old. I've been in hundreds of hotel rooms across 14 states, and I have never once felt the specific quality of wrongness that settled over me sitting at that desk in the gray November light. It wasn't fear, exactly, not yet. It was something colder and more precise. The feeling of running a calculation and getting an answer that the formula says is impossible. Someone had been in my room while I slept. Someone had stood close enough to the nightstand to pick up the receiver, had talked for 11 minutes in a voice low enough that I hadn't stirred, had replaced the phone carefully, had moved toward the door. The chain had been on when I woke up. I kept coming back to that. The chain had been on. I pulled up the hotel's number on my phone, not the front desk extension, the main line. Asked to speak to the general manager. Was told he wouldn't be in until 10. Left my name and room number and said it was urgent. Then I sat at the desk and listened to the climate control hum and looked at the landline and thought about all the things I did not yet know, like how many people had a key to room 318, like whether the hotel's keycard system logged entries, and if so, what last night's log looked like whether the chain being engaged in the morning actually meant what I needed it to mean, or whether there was something about this room, something about this building, that I hadn't accounted for yet. Outside, a door opened some way down the corridor. I turned my head toward the sound before I could stop myself and sat very still, listening to the footsteps pass and fade until the floor went quiet again. The general manager's name was Patrick Eller. He arrived at 10:03, and whatever he'd been told on his way in had done nothing to prepare him for the specific nature of what I was about to explain. He was a composed man, mid-40s, the practiced calm of someone whose job required absorbing bad information without visibly reacting to it. We sat across from each other in a small windowless office behind the front desk, Donna hovering near the door with a paper cup of coffee she'd stopped pretending to drink. I laid it out for him methodically. The voicemail, the call log, Donna's account, the neighbor's account, the chain lock. I did it the way I'd structure a report. Facts, sequence, observable evidence. Because if I let myself speak any other way, I wasn't sure I'd stay as steady as I needed to be. When I finished, Eller was quiet for a moment. "I want to pull the keycard log for your room," he said. "Going back to Tuesday." That was going to be my first question. He nodded and turned to his computer. The room was very quiet. The building's ventilation system pushed recycled air through a vent above us, and I found myself listening to it the way I'd been listening to everything since that morning, parsing it, checking it, running it through a filter that hadn't existed 3 days ago. The log took him about 4 minutes to pull. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he turned the monitor so I could see it and pointed at a line without saying anything. The keycard entries for room 318 over 3 days. My check-in Tuesday afternoon. My various comings and goings. I could trace my own movements and the timestamps with a precision that was briefly disorienting. A precise external record of a trip I'd already lived from the inside. Wednesday morning departure, return at lunch, out again, back at 6:47 p.m. Thursday, the same general shape. And then Thursday, 11:58 p.m. A keycard entry, 43 minutes after the last one I could account for, which was my return to the room at 11:15, followed by locking up and going to bed. Thursday, at 11:58 p.m., a keycard had opened the door to room 318. From the outside. "That's not me," I said. "No." Eller was already picking up his desk phone. "Your last entry before that was 11:15. He met my eyes briefly. "I'm going to call our security contractor. I need you to stay available today. Don't leave the property if you can help it." I went back upstairs. The room looked exactly as it always did. Made bed, curtains open, my laptop on the desk, toiletries lined up in the bathroom with the particular sad precision of a man living out of a suitcase. Stood in the doorway and looked at all of it the way you look at something familiar that has just been revealed as a different thing than you thought. Same surfaces, same objects. Different room now. Someone had a key. Not a glitch, not a misread. A working keycard coded to room 318 that had opened this door at 11:58 p.m. while I was sleeping 4 feet from the nightstand. Which meant either a staff member had accessed the room without authorization, or a card had been issued that shouldn't exist, or a previous guest's key had never been properly deactivated. All of those had names and procedures behind them. All of them were manageable, investigable. None of them explained the 11 minutes on the phone. That kept snagging on me. Because you can attribute a keycard anomaly to a dozen mundane failures. Miscut card, expired deactivation, a housekeeper who should have logged the visit. But the phone call was different. Someone had entered this room, moved to the nightstand, picked up the receiver, and dialed. Not an outside number, not room service, the front desk. Then held the line open for 11 minutes while speaking in a voice low enough not to wake me, then replaced the receiver and crossed the room carefully in the dark. That sequence had the quality of intention that a keycard misfire didn't cover. I needed to know what had been said. I called Donna from the room landline, which felt strange to touch, and asked to speak to the colleague who'd taken the call the night before. Her name was Preeta. Not on shift until 2, but Donna said she'd ask her to come in early. In the meantime, I sat at the desk and worked, or tried to. Made a conference call at 11 and got through it on autopilot, contributing at the right moments, my eyes cycling around the room the entire time. Closet door, bathroom threshold, gap under the bed, space behind the open curtain. The anxious brain, when it doesn't have enough information, makes a threat assessment of every visible surface and then starts on the ones it can't see. I checked behind the shower curtain before I used the bathroom. I am not proud of that. I did it anyway. Preeta arrived at 12:30. Early 20s, earnest, visibly troubled and working to contain it. We sat in the same back office, and I asked her to tell me exactly what she'd heard. She thought carefully before answering. When I picked up, I said the standard greeting, and there was just sound, not silence. The connection was live, ambient noise, the line was open. and voices, but not talking to me. More than one voice. She hesitated. I think so, though it was hard to tell. Could have been one voice, two registers, or a TV. A pause. It didn't sound like a TV. Could you make out words? Not really. One thing, and I might be wrong, but around the 7 or 8 minute mark, the tone changed, got quieter, more. She looked for the word. Concentrated. Like whoever was talking became focused on something specific. She looked at me steadily. I kept saying hello, asking if someone needed help. And there was this one moment where the sound stopped completely for a few seconds, then started again, softer. Like they heard you, I said. She didn't answer immediately. That's what it felt like. Yes. I rode the elevator back to the 3rd floor alone and stood in the corridor outside 318 before going in. Hallway empty in both directions. Ice machine at the far end, exit sign above the stairwell. The muffled ambient noise of someone's television further down. Ordinary daytime hotel sounds, thin and indifferent. My key opened the door. I went in, let it swing shut behind me. The chain lock was right there. Brass, simple, immediate. I engaged it and stood with my hand still on it, feeling the weight of what I now understood, that the chain being on in the morning didn't mean what I'd needed it to mean. If someone had been in this room until 3:15 and left while I slept, I would have been the last person to touch the chain. I would have engaged it myself in the morning, automatically, without knowing what I was sealing in or out. The gap above the chain was about 1.5 inches wide, enough to see a sliver of the corridor outside. I stood there for a long moment, eye level with the gap, looking at the empty hallway through it. Then I took out my phone and called the company travel coordinator and told her I needed a room change. Different floor, different wing if possible, today. She asked if there was a problem with the room. I looked at the nightstand, at the phone, at the smooth plastic receiver in its cradle, the coiled cord, the small red message light that hadn't stopped meaning the same thing since I'd first seen it that morning. Yeah, I said. There's a problem with the room. The room change came through at 2 p.m. 5th floor, opposite wing, 512. I started packing methodically. Toiletries into the bag first, then clothes, then the laptop and its cables. The particular muscle memory of a person who travels constantly and has packed a hotel room so many times the sequence is almost unconscious. That's the only reason I found it. If I'd been less practiced, I would have missed it. I always check the safe before I leave a room, not because I use the safe, but because I've heard enough stories about people leaving things behind in them. Opened it, confirmed it was empty, and then, as I was pressing it shut, I noticed the interior back panel was slightly off-center. A gap along the left edge, maybe 1/4 inch, where the panel had been pulled away from the wall of the safe and not fully reseated. I should have closed the safe and left. Every rational instinct I had said, close the safe and leave. I pulled the panel away from the wall instead. Taped to the back of it, to the interior wall of the safe housing itself, was a phone. A cheap one, prepaid, the kind you buy in a drugstore for $40. Powered off. A strip of electrical tape across the back held it flat against the surface. I stood there looking at it for a long time. Then I took a photo of it with my own phone, replaced the panel exactly as I'd found it, closed the safe, picked up my bags, and walked directly down to Patrick Eller's office without stopping. He stared at the photo. He called the police. What followed was 3 hours I spent sitting in the lobby on a hard chair, watching things happen around me that I was no longer directing. 2 officers, then a detective. The safe was processed. The phone was removed, bagged, examined. Ella pulled his security team into the back office, a conversation I wasn't part of, but could partially observe through the glass partition, the body language of people realizing their protocols had failed in a way that was going to be expensive. The detective, a woman named Arietta, compact and unhurried, came and sat across from me around 4 o'clock. "The phone in the safe," she said. "You have any idea how long it was there?" "No, I never used the safe. I wouldn't have found it at all if the panel hadn't been displaced." "So someone accessed the safe at some point during your stay, or before your stay, prior guest, prior installation. We'll try to pull a timeline from the hotel's records." She made a note. "What I want to focus on for now is the corridor footage." She turned her tablet to face me. The camera covering the third-floor hallway was mounted above the elevator bay, angled to cover the full length of the corridor. The footage was time-stamped and clear enough, gray-toned, slightly fish-eyed, the kind of quality that looks worse than it is until you slow it down. She had already slowed it down. 11:57 p.m. The corridor empty, every door closed, the overhead lights in their dim nighttime setting. Then the elevator opened and a figure stepped out and walked toward room 318. I watched it. The figure was male, medium height, wearing a dark jacket and a cap pulled low. Moving with purpose but without urgency, the confident, unhesitating walk of someone who knew exactly where they were going and had been there before. At room 318, the figure stopped, produced a keycard, and opened the door in one practiced motion. Didn't pause. Didn't look up at the camera. "He knew where it was," I said. "Yes," Arietta said. The door closed. The corridor went still. The timestamp ticked forward. 12, 15, 20 minutes. Then the door opened again, and the figure came back out, pulled it shut, and walked back toward the elevator without looking back, unhurried as before. The elevator opened immediately, like it had been waiting. He stepped in. Gone. I sat with that for a moment. "There's more," Arietta said. She didn't phrase it as a question. She swiped to a second clip. Same corridor, same camera, different timestamp. Tuesday, 11:44 p.m. My second night. The figure again. Standing in the corridor outside room 318, not entering, just standing, facing the door. He stayed there for 6 minutes and 40 seconds by the timestamp, before the elevator opened behind him and he stepped back into it without ever touching the door handle. She swiped again. Monday, my first night. 12:21 a.m. Same figure, same position. Standing outside 318 in the dim hallway light, still and patient, for just under 4 minutes. 3 nights. He'd been outside my door on the first night, the second night, and the third night he'd come inside. The air in the lobby felt different after that. The same recycled hotel air it had been all week, the same faint chemical smell of carpet cleaner and climate control, but thinner somehow, less adequate. I was aware of every entrance I could see from where I was sitting. The revolving door to the street, the side exit near the breakfast area, the door to the stairwell behind the elevator bank, and the ones I couldn't. "Do you know this person?" Arietta asked. "Anyone with a reason to?" "No," I said, before she'd finished the sentence. She looked at me steadily. "Take your time with that." I took my time with it. Thought about my work, about the site visits I'd done all week, about the colleagues and contractors and strangers I'd moved through. Thought about anyone who might know I was in Columbus, in this hotel, in this room. I traveled constantly for work. New cities, new properties, new rooms every few weeks. Nobody tracked that except my company's travel coordinator and whoever had access to those records. "No," I said again, slower. "Nobody." Arietta closed the tablet cover. "We're going to want to talk to your employer about who had access to your travel itinerary." She stood. "In the meantime, I'd strongly recommend you don't stay in this building tonight. Either of those two options applies." She meant a different hotel. She might have meant home. I went up to room 512, the new room on the 5th floor. Sat on the edge of the new bed and looked at the new walls. Thought about the figure on the footage. That flat, professional walk, the cap pulled low, the complete absence of hesitation. 3 nights. Monday, he stood outside for 4 minutes. Tuesday, he stood outside for 6. Thursday, he came in. Whatever this was, it hadn't started as an impulse. He hadn't stumbled into this building by accident, hadn't found my room by chance, hadn't spent 11 minutes on the phone out of curiosity. He had stood outside my door 2 nights in a row, working something out, measuring something. And on the 3rd night, he had decided whatever he was measuring was sufficient. The phone in the safe was the part that stayed with me longest. Because a phone hidden behind the panel of a hotel safe isn't something you leave behind by accident. And it isn't something you install in 20 seconds. It takes time and knowledge and a specific kind of planning. The kind that assumes you're going to want access to whatever that phone records or transmits or receives at some later point. At some later point. I picked up my own phone off the new bed. My hands, I noticed, were not quite steady. I called my wife. Told her I was finishing up early and coming home tonight. That the project had wrapped ahead of schedule. That I'd explain everything when I got there. Just wanted to hear her voice right now. I didn't tell her what I was really thinking. That the project hadn't wrapped. That I'd be back in Columbus in 2 weeks on the same contract, same client, same stretch of highway with its same cluster of mid-range hotels. That whoever this was still out there. And they already knew my schedule better than I did. I drove home that evening. 4 hours, Columbus to Pittsburgh, on a highway that went gray and then black as the November sky dropped its last light somewhere around Zanesville. I had the radio on for about 40 minutes before I realized I hadn't heard a single thing playing on it, and turned it off. Drove the rest of the way in silence, watching headlights come and go in the oncoming lanes. My wife met me at the door, read my face immediately the way she always does, and didn't ask any questions in the doorway, just stepped aside to let me in. We sat at the kitchen table, and I told her everything. The voicemail, Donna, the neighbor, Eller, the keycard log, Preeta's account of 11 minutes of open line and a voice that stopped when it heard her. The footage, with its 3 nights and its escalating timestamps. The phone in the safe. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The phone in the safe," she said. "They think it was recording?" "They don't know yet. Arietta said they'd try to extract data from it, but it was powered off, and she wasn't optimistic. Prepaid phones like that are designed to be disposable." I looked at my hands on the table. The more relevant question is what it was for in the first place. She didn't say anything to that. "Options are recording," I said, the engineer's brain taking over because it was easier than the alternative. Or a drop point. Someone wanted a device in that room that could receive a signal, send a location ping, something operational. Or it was purely for communication. Someone wanted a clean line in that room that wasn't traceable to them. I paused. None of those options are the product of casual interest. My wife is not someone who scares easily. She grew up in a family that didn't have the luxury of being fragile. And over 15 years together, I had seen her navigate genuinely hard things with a steadiness that still impressed me. But sitting across the kitchen table from me that night, she looked frightened in a specific, focused way that was worse to see than I'd expected. "You're going back in 2 weeks," she said. "The contract isn't finished. Marcus." That was all she said, just my name. But the way she said it carried everything. The footage on Arietta's tablet, the figure in the cap walking without hesitation to my door, the phone behind the safe panel. All of it compressed into 2 syllables. "I know," I said. I called Arietta the next morning. She had updates, or the outline of updates, the careful, partial disclosure of an investigation still in motion. The prepaid phone had been successfully powered on, but the internal storage had been wiped, either remotely or manually, before I found it. A clean, professional wipe. Nothing recoverable. The keycard used to access room 318 had been traced to a staff key issued to a housekeeper who'd left the hotel's employment 6 weeks earlier. Her physical card had been turned in and logged as deactivated, but the deactivation had never been processed in the system. A procedural failure, Arietta said, with the flat tone of someone who found the word inadequate. "What about the travel itinerary?" I said. "My employer. We spoke with your company's travel coordinator yesterday afternoon. The itinerary for your Columbus trip was accessible to approximately 40 people within your organization. Standard distribution for project teams. We're working through that list." A pause. "I want to be honest with you. That's a wide net, and it assumes the access point was internal, which we haven't confirmed, meaning he could have gotten it another way, meaning we're looking at multiple avenues." I sat with that after I hung up. 40 people internally, plus however many external avenues Arietta hadn't specified. The hotel's own booking system, the client company's records, the travel coordinator's email. Any one of a dozen places where my name and room number existed as data, sitting in a system, accessible to whoever had thought to look. I'd been in 14 states in the past 2 years. Somewhere in those 14 states, in some interaction I couldn't identify or remember, something had begun. A decision had been made. And then, systematically, patiently, Monday night, Tuesday night, 4 minutes, 6 minutes, keycard, phone, 11 minutes on an open line, it had been acted on. The thing that I kept circling back to, that I still circle back to, is this. He was in my room for approximately 75 minutes, 11:58 to approximately 1:15, based on when the neighbor first heard talking. 75 minutes in a room where I was sleeping. And whatever he did in that time, whatever the phone was for, whatever the call was about, whatever he moved toward or away from in those careful, deliberate steps my neighbor described, he left no physical evidence except a partial boot print on the bathroom tile that Arietta mentioned in passing and then didn't mention again. He had been thorough. He had left one thing behind, and it was behind a panel, and he'd intended to retrieve it. The only reason I found it was because the panel hadn't seated properly when he replaced it. A 1/4 inch of gap along the left edge. One small, physical imprecision in an otherwise meticulous operation. I thought about that a lot in the days after. The margin. How close it had been to being nothing. To my packing the room without checking the safe without noticing the gap without feeling compelled to open it. Any one of those, and I'd have driven home from Columbus with a clean story. Odd voicemail, probably a malfunction, weird business trip, forgotten by the following weekend. Instead, I had security footage and a detective's card in my wallet, and a question I couldn't answer, which was what he had wanted from me badly enough to stand outside my door 3 nights running until he was ready to go in. The elevator doors in the footage opened like they'd been waiting for him. I kept thinking about that, too. The investigation is still open. That's the honest answer to the question I get asked most, which is whether they ever figured out who he was. Arietta called me twice more over the following month. The first call was to tell me the keycard deactivation failure had been traced to a specific gap in the hotel's off-boarding process. A form that wasn't filed, a system that wasn't updated, a housekeeper whose access technically continued for 6 weeks after her last shift. Whether she was involved or whether someone else had obtained her card during those 6 weeks, they couldn't establish. The second call was to tell me they had a person of interest they were looking at in connection with the travel itinerary leak. She didn't give me a name. She said she'd follow up. She hasn't followed up. I went back to Columbus 3 weeks later. Different hotel. I mapped every property within a 5-mile radius of the job site and chose the newest one, the one with the most current keycard infrastructure and the most visible security cameras in the lobby. I checked the safe panel the night I arrived, and every night after that. I checked it when I came back from dinner. I checked it before I went to sleep. I still do that. In every hotel room, in every city. It takes about 4 seconds, and I've done it so many times now that it has become as automatic as locking the deadbolt, as unremarkable as hanging up the Do Not Disturb sign. A small, private ritual that nobody sees me perform. What I haven't been able to shake, and I've thought about this carefully, in the way that you turn a problem over looking for the angle that resolves it, and found no such angle, is the question of the call itself, the 11 minutes. Because the phone in the safe was operational, and the keycard worked, and the wipe was professional, and every piece of this thing had a logic to it that I could follow even when I couldn't identify the purpose. But the phone call to the front desk I have never been able to place inside that logic. He didn't call the front desk to speak to anyone. Prito was there, saying hello, and he didn't answer. He wasn't calling for help. He wasn't calling to establish anything. He called and held the line open for 11 minutes while he talked. To someone, or to himself, or to whatever purpose brought him to that room. And then he hung up and left. I have a theory. I don't love it. My theory is that the call was incidental, that he was on his own phone, or talking to someone in the room, or doing something that required speaking out loud, and at some point in those 11 minutes, accidentally depressed the landline receiver just enough to open a line without realizing it. That the front desk call was a mistake, a slip. His one slip, besides the panel. Which means the version of this story where I never find out anything, where I go home thinking it was a malfunction, where Donna's voicemail gets dismissed as a wrong room number. That version was one stray elbow away from being real. 2 years on, I sleep fine most nights. I'm not someone who catastrophizes, and I've made my peace with the uncertainty, mostly. But every now and then, in a hotel room somewhere, some city, some highway corridor with its ice machines and its buzzing fluorescence, I wake up at 3 in the morning for no reason I can identify, and the first thing I do, before I check my phone, before I look at the door, is listen for a voice. Low and unhurried, speaking carefully in the dark. I checked into a hotel and the key card worked instantly. The front desk said no one had programmed it yet. The drive had taken 11 hours. I want you to understand that before anything else, 11 hours in October rain, a broken wiper on the passenger side that smeared more than it cleared, 2 construction detours that added 40 minutes each, and a coffee that had gone cold somewhere around hour 6, and that I'd finished anyway. By the time the hotel appeared off the interstate exit, I was operating on something below the threshold of normal human function. I wasn't tired so much as hollowed out. The Hargrove Inn was a mid-range chain property, the kind of place that exists in a comfortable fog of sameness, where the carpet pattern and the plastic key sleeves and the small bottles of shampoo are identical to the ones in 40 other hotels in 40 other states, and that's precisely the point. I was there for a sales conference. 3 days, continental breakfast, a complimentary drink ticket I'd probably never use. I'd stayed in this hotel or its exact twin so many times over the past decade that the routine was entirely automatic. Car, lobby, desk, key, elevator, room, done. The lobby was quiet at 11:45 on a Monday, October, off-season, midweek. A young woman at the front desk whose name tag said Renata looked up from her computer with the professional warmth of someone on the back half of a long shift. She pulled up my reservation, confirmed my name, Marcus, 2 nights, non-smoking, and reached for the keycard encoder on the desk. She ran the card through once, looked at her screen, ran it through again. "Sorry, 1 second," she said, with the small frown of someone troubleshooting. She typed something, checked something, ran the card a 3rd time. The frown deepened slightly. She reached under the desk and produced a 2nd blank card and ran that through the encoder instead. "Room 407, she said, handing it to me with a professional smile that had replaced the frown so quickly I almost missed the transition. "Elevators are just to your left." I thanked her. I took the elevator to the 4th floor. I walked to room 407, slid the card into the reader, and the light went green on the first try. I was already inside and setting my bag on the luggage rack before I thought anything of it. The room was standard. Queen bed, desk, window with a view of the parking lot and the interstate beyond it. Orange-gray with the particular light pollution of highway corridors at night. The television was off. The heating unit under the window was running, which was unusual. Hotels typically left the climate control off until the card was inserted, but I assumed someone in housekeeping had bumped it. I turned it down, brushed my teeth, checked my email out of compulsive habit, and was asleep by 12:15. My phone rang at 12:40. Front desk, the screen said. I answered it with the reflexive alarm of anyone who gets a hotel call in the small hours. Fire alarm procedures, noise complaints, the brief disorientation of not knowing what city you're in. Mr. Marcus? Renata's voice, professionally calm and with something underneath it that I was too half asleep to identify properly. I'm so sorry to disturb you. This is going to sound like a strange question, but when you swiped your card at the door just now, did it open on the first try? I sat up. Yes. A pause. Right away. No errors. Yes. Should it not have? Another pause. Longer. No, we had a system issue tonight. Some cards weren't encoding properly. I just wanted to verify yours was working. Her voice was smooth, the explanation was smooth, and I was exhausted enough that I accepted it and went back to sleep without examining why the question had needed to be asked at all. If the card worked, the card worked. Problem solved. I have thought about that phone call many times since, about how she asked whether it had worked rather than telling me it should work now, about the specific quality of that pause. It wasn't until morning that I learned she hadn't encoded my card yet when I used it. I came down early for breakfast, 7 a.m. Conference didn't start until 9. I wanted coffee and quiet. Renata was gone, replaced by a heavy-set man named Paul, who had the comfortable authority of a senior employee. He was the one who brought it up, not me. He flagged me as I was refilling my coffee and said, with the careful tone of a man relaying information he'd been asked to relay, that there'd been a mix-up with my key the previous night. I said I knew that the woman last night had called me about it. He nodded slowly. The thing is, he said, setting his own coffee cup down on the counter, the card you used last night, the first one she tried, it was completely blank. She hadn't encoded it yet. She was in the middle of programming it when she handed it to you by mistake. He looked at me steadily. Those cards don't work. A blank card won't open any door in this building. It's not possible. I looked at him. She assumed it was a reader malfunction, he said. We checked the reader this morning. It's working correctly. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. I took my coffee back to a table by the window and sat there, looking out at the parking lot in the thin gray morning light, and thought about the door opening immediately, the green light, the complete absence of resistance. And I thought about the heating unit already running when I walked in, and the particular quality of the room's warmth, not the sharp, freshly activated warmth of a unit turning on cold, but the even, settled warmth of a room that had been heated for some time, as though someone had been expecting me, as though the room had already been made ready. I went to the conference. I sat through 4 hours of presentations about regional sales targets and Q4 projections and a 40-minute segment on a new CRM platform that nobody in the room wanted and that we were all getting anyway. I drank bad coffee from an urn and shook hands with people I saw twice a year and smiled at things that weren't particularly funny. It was, in other words, a completely normal Tuesday in my professional life, but the hotel room sat at the back of my mind all day like a splinter, small, specific, impossible to stop pressing on. I'm an analytical person by nature. I've spent 20 years in sales, which means I've spent 20 years reading situations, finding the logical through line, locating the angle that explains the behavior. It's not something I switch off. So I'd been turning the keycard problem over all morning, looking for the through line, and what I kept running into was a wall. Paul had said a blank card couldn't open the door. Paul worked there. Paul had no particular reason to invent that. The rational exits I kept trying. Maybe Renata had encoded it partially before handing it over without realizing. Maybe there was a system glitch that had registered my reservation details on the card through some unintended process. Maybe Paul was wrong about what the card could or couldn't do. All possible. None of them satisfying. I went back to the room during the lunch break to drop off a folder and charge my phone. Stood in the doorway for a moment before I went in. I can't tell you exactly why, just that something in me hesitated in a way it hadn't the night before. The room looked exactly as I'd left it. Bed made by housekeeping, surfaces wiped, the plastic wrap back on the drinking glasses. The heating unit was running again. I'd turned it down the night before. I hadn't touched it since. The room should have been cool, October, climate control set low, no one in the room since morning. But it was warm the same way it had been warm when I'd first walked in. That settled, even warmth. The warmth of continuous occupation. I checked the thermostat. It was set to 74. I had set it to 68 the night before. I stood there looking at the thermostat for a moment. Then I turned it back down and went to lunch. Housekeeping, I told myself. Someone had adjusted it while cleaning. Reasonable. Standard. I believed that for approximately 3 hours. The conference wrapped at 6, and a group of colleagues went for dinner at a steakhouse 2 blocks from the hotel. I went because declining felt like more energy than attending, and because the alternative was sitting alone in a room that was warming itself to a temperature I hadn't set. I had 2 drinks, more than I usually do at work functions, less than I wanted, and was back in the lobby by 9:30. Renata was back at the front desk. She looked up when I came in, and something moved briefly across her face. Not quite guilt, not quite relief. Something in between, the expression of a person who has been anticipating a conversation they're not sure how to have. I stopped at the desk. "Paul told me about the card this morning," I said. She held my gaze for a moment. "I know. He told me he'd spoken with you." She paused. "I want to apologize for the confusion last night. I should have been clearer about what happened instead of..." She seemed to choose her next word carefully. "Managing it." "What did happen?" She glanced toward the back office. It was a brief glance, checking, and then she looked back at me. "I handed you the wrong card by mistake, a blank one. When you came back down, I was going to tell you it wouldn't work and give you the correct one, but you didn't come back, and then I saw on the system that your door had been accessed." Another pause. "Correctly accessed. Green light. Full entry log." "And that's not possible." "Not with a blank card, no." "So what did you put in the log?" She looked at me steadily. "I put that there had been an encoding error that self-corrected. Because I didn't have a better explanation, and because you were already in the room and nothing bad had happened, and the simplest thing was to..." She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. The simplest thing was to move on. I appreciated her honesty enough not to push further. I thanked her and went to the elevator. On the 4th floor, I walked the corridor to 407 and stood outside the door for a moment. The same hesitation as at lunch, stronger now. I swiped the card. The light went green. Inside, the room was warm, 74 degrees. Exactly. I hadn't touched the thermostat since I'd reset it at noon, and it had moved back to the same number on its own. I checked it twice, certain I was misreading, and both times it said 74. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room around me. The standard furniture, the corporate artwork bolted to the walls, the window with its view of the parking lot going dark under a sky that had been threatening rain all day and was finally making good on it, drops beginning to trace lines down the glass. Everything exactly as it should be, except the room kept being 68 degrees when I left it and 74 when I came back. And a blank card kept opening a door it had no business opening. And on the desk, I noticed it now, properly, for the first time. There was a glass of water. Full, clear, set precisely in the center of the desk's leather blotter. I had not put it there. I hadn't used the desk at all. The drinking glasses were on the bathroom counter where housekeeping left them, still wrapped in plastic. This glass was unwrapped, filled, placed with a deliberateness that felt almost formal. I stood up and went to it. No condensation on the outside. The water had been sitting long enough to reach room temperature, the same temperature as the room itself. As though it had been poured a while ago by someone who had then settled in to wait. I looked at the glass for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and booked a different hotel 3 miles up the road. I didn't check out that night. That's the part I still don't know how to explain. I packed my bag, I had my keys, I had the new reservation confirmed on my phone, and then I sat on the edge of that warm bed in that warm room, and I didn't leave. Something about the quality of the waiting in that room, that patient, settled, expectant warmth, made leaving feel less like escape and more like something else, like being rude to someone who'd gone to a great deal of trouble. I slept with the lights on. I didn't touch the glass of water. In the morning it was gone. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say it was gone. The glass wasn't in the bathroom. It wasn't on the nightstand or the floor or the windowsill. It wasn't in the trash, wasn't sitting on the heating unit, wasn't anywhere in the room that I could find after a search methodical enough that I was mildly embarrassed by it. I checked under the bed. I checked the closet. A full glass of room temperature water that had been sitting on the center of the desk blotter when I fell asleep with the lights on had simply ceased to be in the room by the time I woke up. The desk blotter was dry. Not even a ring. I sat in the desk chair and looked at the dry blotter for a while. I'm a person who proceeds through the world by building explanations. It's how I'm wired. It's what I do. I lined the facts up the way I'd line up a weak sales quarter and tried to find the story that accounted for all of them. The card, the heat, the thermostat resetting itself twice to the same specific number, the glass appearing, placed with precision, and then disappearing without a trace before housekeeping had been in the room. I couldn't build the story. The facts didn't add up to anything that made sense, which meant either I was missing something or the something I was missing was the kind I didn't have a framework for. I went to breakfast, I drank my coffee, and I made a decision. There was a woman at the conference named Delgado, first name Patricia, though she went by Pat, who handled risk assessment for the Western region and who I'd known casually for 6 or 7 years. She was sharp and unsentimental and had a background in insurance investigation before she'd moved into sales, which meant she knew how to find information about properties. I found her at the coffee urn and asked her, as offhandedly as I could manage, if she knew how to pull incident records for a commercial property. She looked at me over her cup. What kind of incident? I'm not sure yet. She studied me for a moment. Pat Delgado had the particular gift of knowing when someone was giving her a partial story and choosing not to push. Guest records are protected, she said, but incident reports filed with the city are public record if there was a police or fire response. What's the property? I told her the hotel name. She pulled it up on her phone in under 3 minutes and turned the screen toward me without comment. There had been 3 incident reports filed at the Hargrove Inn in the past 11 years. A kitchen fire in 2016, minor. A guest medical emergency in 2019, non-fatal. And a death in 2021, a guest, 4th floor, ruled natural causes. A man named David Pierce, 57 years old, from out of state. Found in his room by housekeeping on the 2nd morning of a 3-day stay. 4th floor. I handed Pat her phone back and thanked her and spent the rest of the morning session not hearing a single word of the presentation. Room numbers aren't in public incident reports. I know that. Pat had told me that when she handed me the phone. But I knew the 4th floor. I'd walked its corridor twice a day for 2 days. I knew it was a short floor, a quiet floor, the kind that gets the overflow guests and the long-term conference bookings and the people like me who just needed something functional and unremarkable. I went back to the hotel at lunch. Paul was at the desk. I stood in front of him and asked him directly, the way I ask direct questions in negotiations, leaving no comfortable conversational exit. What room had the death been in? In 2021, the man named David Pierce. Paul looked at me for a long moment. He had the expression of a man running a rapid internal calculation. How much do I have to tell this person? What happens if I don't? What happens if I do? We don't typically share that information, he said. I know. I'm asking anyway. Another long moment. Why? Because I've been staying in 407 for 2 nights, and some things have happened in that room that I'd like context for. Something shifted in his face when I said 407. It was a small shift, the kind you only catch if you've spent years watching people's faces for the thing underneath the thing they're saying. He picked up his pen, set it down again, looked past me briefly at the lobby and then back. Our policy is not to assign that room to guests, he said carefully. There's a notation in the system. It gets flagged as unavailable for booking. He paused. Renata was working her 3rd double shift in a row on Monday night. She's been here 4 months. She may not have... He stopped, cleared his throat. I'm not sure how you ended up in 407. The cold that moved through me then was clean and total, the kind that starts in the chest and radiates outward. I'd been in a room flagged as unavailable, a room that shouldn't have been assigned and almost certainly had not been assigned, which would explain why the card had been blank when it opened the door, because the card hadn't been programmed with an available room in the system. Room 407 existed somewhere outside the hotel's active inventory, a door with no current key. And yet the door had opened. The room had been warm. Someone had poured a glass of water and left it on the desk. I thought about David Pierce, 57 years old, found by housekeeping on his 2nd morning. I thought about what the room must have been like when they found it, whether the heat had been on, whether there had been anything on the desk, whether it had felt, to the housekeeping staff who entered it, like a room being kept ready, like a room that had been waiting for someone to come back to it. I went upstairs and packed my bag properly this time, zipped it, slung it over my shoulder, took one last look at the room. The thermostat read 74. I hadn't touched it. I went to the elevator and hit the button for the lobby and watched the doors close on the corridor and kept my eyes front and didn't look back down the hall toward 407. I was almost certain that if I had, I would have seen the light under the door, warm and steady and on, the way a room looks when someone inside it is awake and waiting and has been for a very long time. The new hotel was 3 miles up the interstate, and everything the Hargrove Inn was not. New construction, bright lobby, a front desk clerk who programmed my key card with visible, deliberate efficiency and handed it over with the cheerful certainty of someone who had never once questioned whether a door would open. The room smelled of fresh paint and synthetic lavender. The thermostat was exactly where I set it when I walked in and exactly where I left it when I came back from dinner. The heating unit only ran when I asked it to. It was fine. It was completely fine. I told myself that repeatedly over the course of the evening with the specific frequency of a person who needs the telling. The conference wrapped the following afternoon. I shook the last of the hands, exchanged the last of the business cards, and pointed my car back toward the interstate, feeling the particular relief of a trip that was almost over. The drive home was clear, no rain, late afternoon sun cutting low and amber across the highway, the kind of October light that makes everything look briefly significant. I had the radio on. I was fine. I was an hour from home when my phone buzzed with an email notification. I didn't look at it while driving. I pulled into a rest stop 20 minutes later to use the bathroom and get coffee and checked it there, standing by the vending machines in the flat fluorescent light of a highway rest stop at 4 in the afternoon. It was a receipt, a hotel receipt formatted with the Hargrove Inn's logo at the top, the same clean corporate template they'd slid under my door on checkout morning, the same column of charges and dates and room number. Room 407, 2 nights. My name, my work email address. That much was expected. What wasn't expected was the line at the bottom of the itemized charges, below the room rate and the tax and the parking fee, in the same plain font as everything else. Late checkout fee, room 407, 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., $45. I had checked out at 9:30 in the morning. I had watched Paul process my checkout at the front desk. I had handed in my key card, the key card that had never been programmed. that it opened a door it had no technical ability to open, and Paul had taken it and wished me a safe drive, and I had walked out of the lobby with my bag over my shoulder and driven 3 miles up the road to a different hotel. Someone had been in that room until 2 in the afternoon. I stood in the rest stop holding my phone and read the receipt 3 more times. The charge was real. The timestamp was real. Room 407 had been occupied for 3 hours after I left it, by my account, under my name. I called the hotel. Paul answered. Of course it was Paul. It was always Paul, steady and careful and carrying more knowledge of that building than he ever fully deployed in conversation. I read him the charge. There was a silence on his end that lasted long enough that I checked to make sure the call was still connected. That shouldn't be on there, he said quietly. No. I processed your checkout myself. You were gone by 9:30. I know. Another silence. I'll have it removed. That's not... I stopped, pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of my nose, tried to locate the right question among the several wrong ones. Paul, when David Pierce died in 2021, what time did housekeeping find him? The silence this time was of a different quality, longer, the kind that confirms rather than considers. Mr. Marcus, what time? A slow exhale. Early afternoon, he said. Just after 2. I stood very still in the rest stop. The vending machine next to me hummed steadily. A family with 2 small children moved through the space behind me, the kids arguing about something inconsequential and bright. The ordinary world, going about its ordinary business, completely indifferent to the fact that I was standing in it holding a phone and understanding something I didn't want to understand. David Pierce had been alive in that room until just after 2 in the afternoon, and whatever had been in that room since, whatever had kept the heat at 74 and poured a glass of water and pressed itself into the dark space behind a blank keycard slot and pulled the door open, had charged my account for the hours between my departure and his, as though those hours were owed, as though someone had been continuing an occupancy that had never properly ended. I thanked Paul and ended the call. I bought a coffee I didn't drink. I sat in my car in the rest stop parking lot and looked at the receipt on my phone until the screen timed out and went dark. Then I looked up David Pierce. It took less time than it should have. His obituary was still indexed, the kind of sparse, dutiful write-up that appears in small regional papers for people who die without much family to compose anything more. 57 years old, sales professional, 22 years in the industry, annual conference attendee, the same conference I had just spent 3 days at. My hands were completely steady, which I found strange. I'd expected them to shake. Instead, I just sat there with that terrible, clarifying stillness that comes when something slots into place so completely that your body doesn't know what reaction to produce. Same conference, same hotel, same room. I thought about the glass of water placed in the center of the desk, the care of it, the deliberateness, the way you'd set something out for a guest you were expecting. I thought about a door opening for a card that had no right to open it. I thought about a room that had been flagged unavailable for 2 years, sitting on the 4th floor of a mid-range chain hotel off the interstate, warm and waiting with the lights on. I thought about what it means to wait for someone for 2 years and then watch them pack their bag and leave. I put the car in drive. I pulled back onto the interstate. I drove the remaining hour home without the radio on, in the particular silence of a person sitting with something they have no framework for and have accepted, finally, that they never will. I've been home for 6 weeks now. My apartment is on the 12th floor of a building in the city, modern, well-lit, the kind of place with a reliable elevator and a doorman and neighbors close enough that you can hear them through the walls if they're watching something loud. I've lived here for 4 years. I know it sounds the way you know the sounds of any place you've slept in long enough. The particular knock of the pipes when the building's heat kicks on in the mornings, the way the refrigerator cycles through its compressor hum at night, the faint percussion of the upstairs neighbor's footsteps. It's a known place. It's mine. I check the thermostat more than I used to, not obsessively, I want to be clear about that because I've spent 6 weeks being careful about what I let this become. I'm not unraveling. I'm not lying awake cataloging every sound. But I check it. In the morning before I leave for work, and in the evening when I come home, I look at the number on the thermostat and I note whether it's the number I left it at. It always is. I know it always will be. I check it anyway. The late checkout charge was removed from my bill. Paul handled it personally. I got a corrected receipt 2 days after I got home. No charge, no explanation, just the revised total and a one-line note that said the error had been corrected. I filed it and didn't call him back. There was nothing useful left to say between us, and I think we both knew it. I looked into David Pierce more thoroughly once I was home, in the way I hadn't let myself do in the rest stop parking lot with a highway coffee going cold in my hand. His obituary had been sparse, but it was enough to start with. 22 years in sales, regional distribution, based in a city 4 states from the Hargrove Inn. He'd attended the Midwest Regional Sales Conference, my conference, the one I'd just spent 3 days at, for 11 consecutive years before his death. Same hotel every time, based on a reference and a condolence comment from a colleague on a professional networking site. Always stays at the Hargrove, always room 407 if he can get it. Creature of habit, the commenter had written with obvious affection. Loves that room for some reason. I read that 3 times. Loves that room for some reason. He'd been going back to that room every year for over a decade, and then one year he'd gone back and hadn't come home. I've thought a great deal about what the room was doing in the 2 years between his death and my arrival. Whether it waited with any awareness of waiting, whether whatever was present in that space experienced the 2 years in any way that resembles how I experience time, or whether it was simply there, continuous and patient, the way a stone is patient, the way a room is patient, full of a warmth that had nowhere to go. I don't know what David Pierce believed about what happens after. I don't know if it matters. What I keep returning to, the thing that sits with me most persistently, is this. A blank keycard opened a door it couldn't open. I believe Paul when he said it was impossible. I believe Renata when she said the card was unprogrammed. I have turned that over 6 weeks now from every angle my analytical mind can access, and I cannot find the explanation that accounts for it, except one. The door recognized something else, not the card, something that came through the corridor with me. Something that moved the way I moved and stood where I stood and wanted in the same direction I was going. Something that had been making that walk down the 4th floor corridor, key in hand, for 11 years before I ever set foot in the building. I don't know if David Pierce was behind me or beside me or somewhere I don't have the architecture to locate. I don't know if he was trying to get back to his room or if I was simply the available vehicle, the stranger walking the right corridor at the right time, moving in the right direction. Useful by coincidence. I don't know if that's better or worse. The conference is annual. My company attends every year. My manager has already sent the save the date for next October. Same city, same venue, same 3 days of presentations and bad coffee and handshakes with people I see twice a year. The Hargrove Inn. I'll book somewhere else. I've already decided that, already picked the property, already noted the address in my calendar 3 days before the conference block, so I don't forget. 3 miles up the road, the bright lobby, the efficient front desk clerk, the room that stays the temperature I set it to. But I've thought about room 407. I've thought about it more than is comfortable to admit. About what it is now, whether the room is still flagged unavailable in Paul's system, whether it still sits on the 4th floor in the quiet part of the building running warm in the dark, whether whatever is in there has settled back into its waiting, or whether something shifted when I left, whether it knows now that the person it's been waiting for isn't coming back through that door. I hope it does. That's the honest truth of how I feel about it. I hope that what's in that room has found some version of understanding, some way to release what it's been holding since an afternoon in 2021 when a 57-year-old man lay down in the room he loved and didn't get back up. I hope the warmth has somewhere to go now. I hope the water doesn't need pouring anymore. I'm not a person who deals in hope usually. I'm an analytical person. I deal in facts and through lines and the logical architecture of explainable things. But some things don't have a through line. Some things just happened, and they sit in the record of your life without resolution, taking up the space they take up, changing the way you move through rooms that are not yours. I check the thermostat. I sleep with the lights off because I refuse to give it more than that. But I check the thermostat every single time. The Airbnb reviews all mentioned a strange smell in the walls. When I moved the dresser, I found a hole cut into the drywall. The smell hit me before I'd even put my bag down. Not overwhelming, nothing that would make you turn around and leave, more like the idea of a smell, something you catch at the edge of your senses and immediately start explaining away. Damp wood, maybe. Old insulation. The particular mustiness of a house that's been closed up for a week between guests. The smell of a space that's been breathing its own air for too long. I told myself all of this while I did a slow first walk-through, the way you do in any unfamiliar place. Opening doors, testing light switches, locating the thermostat. Normal arrival behavior. The smell was part of the house, and the house was fine. It was a Thursday in early November, and I'd driven 3 hours into the Berkshires specifically to be somewhere that wasn't my apartment. The job I'd left in September had taken 2 years and most of my equilibrium with it, and my therapist had said, with the particular brand of careful emphasis she reserved for things she'd said more than once, that I needed to stop treating stillness as a problem to be solved and just let myself be somewhere quiet for a few days. So I'd booked the place, a converted 1920s farmhouse rental, 4 nights, just me. And I'd packed 2 books I probably wouldn't read and a bottle of wine I would definitely open tonight, and I'd driven until the GPS stopped routing me through towns I recognized. The listing photos had been good. Warm lighting, wide plank floors, a cast iron fireplace in the main room, a clawfoot tub that I had specifically factored into my decision. The reviews were mostly excellent. The host was responsive, the kitchen was well stocked, the Wi-Fi was reliable for a remote property. The nearest town was 15 minutes and had a decent grocery store. 4.8 stars across 60-something reviews. I'd read those reviews carefully the night before, the way I always do, because I am constitutionally incapable of booking anything without reading every review, including the ones that give 3 stars, because the throw pillows were scratchy. And most of them were fine, enthusiastic even. But there was a phrase that had turned up in maybe 5 or 6 of them, spread across different months, different seasons, worded differently each time, that I'd noticed and then mentally filed under not a deal breaker. Odd smell near the back bedroom. There's a slightly musty odor on the east side of the house. Not terrible, but worth mentioning. The smell in the main bedroom took a day or 2 to get used to. The host says it's the old pipes. The host's response to these comments was consistent and breezy. Old farmhouse, original plumbing in the east wall, working on it. 4 exclamation points spread across 3 years of identical explanations. I'd looked at that response and thought, reasonable. Old farmhouse. Of course there are pipe smells. I'd grown up in a house built in 1940, and I knew what old plumbing sounded like, smelled like, the particular personality of infrastructure that has outlived several generations of occupants. So I put my bag in the main bedroom, cracked the window 2 inches, and went to open the wine. The fireplace worked exactly as advertised, which improved everything. I ate the sandwich I'd packed for the drive, drank most of a glass of Burgundy, and sat in front of the fire with the book I wasn't going to read and felt, for the first time in a long time, something approaching actual rest. The house was quiet in the way rural houses are quiet, not silent, but layered. Wind against the old window frames, the fire settling, the periodic creak of the structure adjusting to the cold outside. Good sounds, inhabited sounds. The smell was there if I went looking for it, but easy enough to ignore while the fire was going. I went to bed around 10. Lay in the dark, the window still cracked, cold, clean air coming in over the mustier layer beneath it, and stared at the ceiling and let my mind go soft the way it hadn't in months. The bedroom was at the back of the house, east-facing, just as the reviews had specified. 1 window, 1 door, A tall antique dresser against the interior wall, a braided rug on the floor between the bed and the dresser. Simple room. Good bed. The smell was slightly stronger in here than in the main living area, but not enough to keep me awake. I was almost asleep when I heard it. Just once, very faint, coming from somewhere behind or inside the wall to my right. A soft sound, not mechanical, not the house settling, not pipes. Something that had a texture to it that pipes don't have. A sound that took me a long moment to place, lying there in the dark with my eyes open. A sound like something shifting its weight. I lay still for a full minute, listening the way you listen in an unfamiliar place at night, every sense narrowed to a single point, body perfectly motionless, ears reaching into the dark for repetition, confirmation. The sound didn't come again. The wall was quiet. The house was quiet. Just wind against the old frames, just the last of the fire cooling in the next room, just the ordinary night sounds of a building that had been standing in a cold field for 100 years and had accumulated the vocabulary of its own age. I told myself, mouse, old farmhouse, rural property, November. Of course there were mice. The walls of a 1920s farmhouse were an entire ecosystem of gap and cavity and ancient insulation. And whatever I'd heard had almost certainly been something small, moving through the space between interior and exterior wall, not weight shifting. Just an animal doing what animals do inside old walls at night. I went to sleep telling myself this, and I mostly believed it. Morning was fine. Better than fine, actually. The kind of crisp gray November morning that makes you feel like coming here was the right decision. I made coffee in the well-stocked kitchen, wrapped myself in the throw blanket from the couch, and sat on the back porch for 20 minutes, watching the field behind the house go from dark to silver in the early light. The smell was barely noticeable out there. Inside, it was stronger, the way it always is in the morning before you've aired anything out. And I opened the bedroom window wider and the kitchen window and let the cold move through. The day I spent doing exactly what I'd come here to do, which was nothing. A walk along the dirt road that ran beside the property, a long bath in the clawfoot tub that was every bit as good as advertised, leftover soup from the grocery run I'd done on the drive-in, eaten standing at the kitchen counter while I scrolled my phone with the particular low-grade guilt of someone who has promised herself a digital detox and is already failing at it. I didn't think about the sound. It was daytime, and the sound was a mouse, and I had come here specifically to stop catastrophizing small things, so I didn't think about it. That night, though, I left the bedside lamp on low. I told myself it was just for reading. I had the book open on the pillow beside me, and I read maybe 6 pages before I realized I wasn't absorbing any of it, just moving my eyes across words while the other part of my attention stayed very still and very alert, aimed at the wall to my right. Nothing happened until just past midnight. Then, the smell got worse. Not dramatically. Not the sudden fetid surge that would have had me out of bed immediately. It thickened, the way a smell does when the source gets closer or the air shifts. And it was different at midnight than it had been at 10 or 11. Less like damp and more like, I'm going to describe this as accurately as I can, more like something organic, something that was not the house itself, but was inside the house. The distinction probably sounds subtle, and I'm telling you it wasn't subtle at all. Not once I was lying still in the dark with nothing else to focus on. I sat up. The smell was strongest near the dresser. I noticed that with a clarity that surprised me, not diffused throughout the room, not coming from the window or the door, but concentrated in the 6-foot space between the foot of the bed and the interior wall where the dresser stood. A tall, antique piece, dark wood, 4 drawers, the kind of furniture that looks original to the house because it probably is. It had clearly always been there, positioned to cover most of that wall, heavy enough that moving it would require actual effort. I got out of bed. I want to be honest here. I was scared, but I was also operating on that specific frequency of alertness where the fear and the need to know exist in equal measure, and the need to know wins. I crossed to the dresser, crouched down beside it, and pressed my face close to the gap between its side edge and the wall. The smell hit me full and direct, and it was not the pipes. It was not damp wood or old insulation or anything the host's breezy response had suggested. It was dense and organic and wrong in the way that things that have been enclosed too long are wrong, not quite rot, not quite must, but the specific thick smell of a space that has been sealed and inhabited simultaneously. I stood up fast, stepped back, stood in the middle of the room with my heart doing something unsteady and my hands cold, and looked at the dresser as though it had just said something to me. I checked the door, locked, chain on, the way I'd left it. Checked the window, 2 inches open, screen intact. Checked the closet, which was empty and smelled like cedar and cedar only. Then I stood at the foot of the bed and I looked at the dresser again, and I made myself think clearly. There was something behind it. Not a mouse, not plumbing. Something behind the dresser was generating an organic smell that strengthened at night and had been doing so consistently enough that at least 5 separate guests had mentioned it in online reviews over 3 years, and the host knew it was there and had chosen a stock response instead of fixing it. I thought about calling the host. It was 12:30 a.m., and I thought about it anyway. Then I thought about what I would say. There's a smell. I think it might be behind the dresser. And imagined the response. Old farmhouse. Old pipes. Working on it. The same 3 sentences in a different order. I went back to bed instead, lay there with the lamp on and the smell present and the wall silent now. No sounds from inside it. Nothing to confirm the thing I was already mostly certain of. I told myself I would look in the morning, in daylight, when everything is more manageable. I would move the dresser a few inches in the morning and look at the wall behind it, and whatever was there would have a practical explanation, a plumbing explanation, an old farmhouse explanation, and I would feel slightly foolish and considerably relieved. I kept the lamp on all night. In the morning, I made coffee first. 2 full cups, standing at the kitchen counter, watching the field do its gray to silver thing again. I ate the last of the granola bar from my bag. I checked my phone. I responded to 2 work emails I'd been avoiding for days. I took my time. Then I went to the bedroom, and I put both hands on the side of the dresser, and I pulled. It was heavier than I'd expected, the kind of heavy that comes from age and solid wood and decades of standing in one place. And it scraped across the floorboards loudly in the still morning, a sound that made me wince even though I was alone. I pulled it out maybe 18 inches. Enough to see the wall. Then I stopped pulling, because the wall behind the dresser was not wallpaper or plaster or the original wainscoting that ran along the rest of the room. It was drywall, newer, distinctly newer than the surrounding walls, the seams still faintly visible around the perimeter of a patched section roughly 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall. And in the center of that drywall patch, at about waist height, someone had cut a hole. Not a crack. Not damage. A hole, clean-edged, deliberate, roughly the size of a large fist, the kind of opening that takes a tool and a decision and a specific amount of time to make. The cut edges were smooth. Someone had done this carefully. The smell was pouring through it. I stood there with my hands still on the dresser and looked at that hole in the wall and felt the bottom drop very quietly and completely out of the morning. I did not look through it immediately. I want to be clear about that, because in retrospect, the sequence of my decisions matters. I stood back. I put distance between myself and the dresser, 3 full steps, and I looked at the hole from across the room the way you look at something that might be dangerous before you've established whether it is. The smell was stronger now, the gap between dresser and wall acting as a channel, funneling whatever was behind it directly into the room. And I stood there with my arms crossed and my heart loud, and I made myself think in an orderly way about what I was looking at. A patched section of wall, newer drywall behind a very old, very heavy piece of furniture. A hole cut at waist height through the center of that patch with smooth edges that said tool and intention and time. 3 possibilities arranged themselves without invitation. Something had been sealed into this wall at some point, a cavity, a conduit, a space of some kind, and the patch was a repair over whatever opening had been necessary to access it. Or the hole was part of ongoing access, someone still using it, still reaching through, still needing whatever was on the other side. Or the hole faced the other direction, was meant not to reach through but to see through, into the bedroom from the wall. I stood at the foot of the bed and turned slowly and looked at the dresser from the angle of someone lying in it. And yes, straight line from the pillow to the dresser to the hole behind it. If the dresser were pushed back, flush against the wall, the hole would be perfectly blocked. But in its current position, it wasn't flush. There was a gap of maybe 2 inches between the dresser's back panel and the wall, enough to let the smell through, enough to let sound through, maybe enough, if the angle was right, to let light through. The thin, amber light of a bedside lamp left on all night. I pulled my phone out and turned the flashlight on. I crossed back to the dresser, crouched down, angled the beam through the hole. The space on the other side was not a wall cavity. It was not a pipe chase or an insulation gap or any of the structural explanations I'd been building. It was a room, not a finished room, no flooring, no lighting, bare studs visible along the sides, but a space with enough depth and height that the flashlight beam disappeared into it before it found a back wall. An unfinished chamber running along the interior east side of the house, concealed behind the finished drywall of the bedroom. I could see the floor of it through the hole, concrete or something close to it, and on that floor, directly beneath the hole, a scattering of objects rendered flat and colorless by the flashlight beam. A water bottle, empty, the label facing up. A folded piece of fabric that might have been a blanket, and something else. A dark rectangle I couldn't immediately identify until I shifted the angle and the light caught it at a different pitch. A phone, face down, plugged into something I couldn't see, charging. I straightened up so fast I hit the back of my head on the underside of the dresser top, and it didn't matter, it didn't register, because my entire nervous system had just rerouted itself around a single central fact. Someone was using the space behind this wall, not historically, not some previous tenant's abandoned belongings. The phone was charging. The phone had a cable running to a power source. Someone had set that up and was maintaining it and intended to come back to it, and that someone had cut a hole through the drywall at the exact height and angle to look directly at the bed I had been sleeping in for 2 nights. I grabbed my bag from the floor. I did not pack it. I took it by the strap, and I went to the bedroom door, and I stopped. The door to the bedroom opened onto the hallway, which ran the length of the house. Bedroom at the east end, living room and front door at the west. 40 feet, maybe 45, of corridor between me and the exit. On the right side of that hallway, a closed door I'd assumed was a utility closet. I'd tried it on the first night and found it locked, and the host's welcome booklet had said something about a storage area not included in the rental, maintenance access only, and I'd accepted that without question, the way you accept explanations that are delivered to you in a laminated booklet. Maintenance access. On the right side of the hallway, the east side of the house. I stood in the bedroom doorway and looked at that closed door 30 feet away and understood with the specific, nauseating clarity of a thing that should have been obvious sooner that the locked utility closet and the space behind my bedroom wall were almost certainly the same space, connected, and that whoever had a key to that door had direct access to the room where I'd been sleeping. The house was quiet. November morning light through the hallway window, pale and flat. The fire long cold in the main room. My car in the gravel drive outside, visible through the window at the end of the hall, 20 feet past the locked door. I stepped into the hallway. My socks on the old floorboards made a sound I hated, not loud, but present, the soft compression of weight on wood that announces exactly where you are in a house to anyone listening. I moved anyway, kept to the edge where the boards were oldest and least likely to shift. Eyes on the locked door as I passed it, the gap at its base. No light under it, no sound. 12 feet, 8, past it. The front door was a deadbolt and a chain, and both of them had been engaged from the inside when I'd gone to bed, which meant, and I was doing this arithmetic as I was moving, my hands already reaching, that whatever access that door provided, whoever used it, They had not come through the front last night. They had another way in. The thought arrived, and I filed it immediately into the category of things to process later. Once I was outside, once I was in my car, once the gravel was moving under my tires, I got the chain off, got the deadbolt turned, opened the door to the cold gray morning and the smell of dead leaves and car exhaust from the road and air that had nothing wrong with it at all. I was across the porch and at my car before the front door had swung fully open behind me. Inside, engine on, doors locked, gravel under the tires exactly the way I'd needed it to be. I was at the end of the property drive, about to turn onto the road, when I glanced in the rearview mirror. The front door of the farmhouse was closed. I had left it open. I didn't pull onto the road. I sat at the end of the drive with the engine running and both hands on the wheel and stared at the rearview mirror until my eyes ached. The farmhouse sat back from the road maybe 60 feet, framed by dead November trees, the front door now definitively closed against the gray morning. Not blown shut. The morning was still, no wind to speak of, and the door had been wide open when I crossed the porch, propped that way by its own weight on the slight lean of the old frame. I knew this because I'd noticed it, specifically in the way you notice things when every sense you have is running at maximum. It had been open. Someone had closed it from inside. I called 911 from the end of that driveway. I want to be precise about the timeline because the dispatcher asked me to be precise about it. I had exited the property at approximately 9:14 a.m. I placed the call at 9:17. I described the hole in the wall, the space behind it, the charging phone, the locked utility closet, the closed front door. The dispatcher was calm and methodical and asked me twice if I was certain the door had been open when I left, and I said yes both times, clearly, with the particular emphasis of someone who is very certain and very aware that certainty is the only thing they have to offer right now. She told me to stay in my vehicle and not re-enter the property. I had no intention of re-entering the property. 2 cruisers arrived 11 minutes later, which felt like considerably longer than 11 minutes. I watched from my car as 2 officers approached the front door, knocked, announced themselves, tried the handle. Locked now. They radioed something I couldn't hear. One went around the back, the other stood at the front. A 3rd unit arrived and I watched them coordinate in the way law enforcement coordinates. Economy of movement, a shared language of gestures, and then the front door came open and all 3 went inside. I watched the house for 24 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard the entire time, each minute passing with a weight that minutes don't usually have. At minute 7, a 4th officer arrived and went in. At minute 14, an ambulance appeared at the end of the road, and I sat up sharply, every muscle braced, but it idled at the property entrance and didn't move with any urgency. At minute 19, one of the original officers came back out and walked to my car. His name was Ferreira. Mid-30s, unhurried in the way of someone who has learned that urgency communicates itself better through stillness than through motion. He crouched beside my window, and I lowered it, and he said, without preamble, "Can you confirm which bedroom you were staying in?" "Back of the house, east side." "And the dresser, you moved it this morning?" "About 18 inches, enough to see the wall." He wrote something. "Is there anything you touched in the space behind the wall? Did you reach through the opening at any point?" "No, I looked through with a flashlight, that's all." He nodded, made another note. Then he looked at me with the kind of direct, careful attention that people in his profession deploy when they're about to say something they want to land correctly. "There's a concealed space running the length of the east wall," he said. "Access through the utility closet in the hallway. It appears to have been used as a living space at some point. We're still assessing." I heard every word and understood each one individually, and together they formed a sentence I couldn't fully absorb. "A living space," I said. "Mattress, some personal belongings, food, the phone you mentioned." A pause. Evidence of habitation over an extended period. The cold was coming through the open window, but I didn't feel it. "Is someone in there right now?" "The space is clear," he said. "Whoever was there is not there currently." Whoever was there. Present tense implication. not historically, not some remnant of a previous occupant. Someone who had been there recently enough that the mattress held a depression and the food was not expired, and a phone was still pulling charge from an outlet they'd wired into the wall themselves, an outlet that was not on any schematic and had not been installed by any contractor the property records showed. "The hole," I said. "The hole in the wall behind the dresser. Can you tell which direction it was cut from?" Ferreira looked at me for a moment, the kind of look that contains an answer the person is deciding whether to give. "Why do you ask?" "Because if it was cut from the bedroom side, it was an access point, something to reach through." I paused. "And if it was cut from the other side, it was for something else." He held my gaze, steady, unhurried. "We're still processing the scene," he said. He didn't say it wasn't cut from the other side. I sat with that for a moment, the engine running, the heater doing its patient work against the cold. 2 nights. I had slept in that room for 2 nights with the lamp on, the amber glow pressing through the gap between the dresser and the wall. And on at least one of those nights there had been someone on the other side of a hole that had been made, carefully and deliberately, at exactly the height of a person sitting up in bed. "The host," I said. "The listing host. Have you?" "We're looking into the property records," he said. "I can't comment further on that right now." Which told me something. He took my contact information, gave me a case number, and told me someone would be in touch. He was professional and thorough, and he did not once suggest I had overreacted or misread what I'd found. That absence of reassurance was its own kind of answer, the kind a seasoned officer gives when the situation doesn't merit reassurance. I drove away from that driveway, and I didn't look in the rearview mirror this time. I drove for about 20 minutes before my hands started shaking on the wheel. That delayed physical response that adrenaline holds off for as long as it can and then releases all at once when the immediate danger has passed. I pulled into a gas station and sat in the parking lot with the shaking moving through me in slow waves, and I thought about 5 or 6 previous guests who had mentioned the smell in their reviews and accepted the host's explanation and slept 2 nights in that room and then gone home and not known. Not known what had been behind that wall while they slept. Not known what had been looking. I thought, they were all as lucky as me, and they don't even know it. I thought, or maybe they weren't all as lucky, and some of them just don't know that either. Then I stopped thinking and just let the shaking finish. The investigation took 11 weeks to produce anything official. What eventually came back to me came in pieces, through the detective who'd taken over from Ferreira, through a victim advocate the department assigned me who called every 2 weeks with careful, measured updates, and through a local news article I found by accident one night in January while looking for something else entirely. I read it 3 times in the blue light of my laptop and then closed it and sat in my apartment for a long time without turning on any other lights. The host was not the property owner. That was the first thing, the thing that reframed everything else. The listing had been running for 3 years under a name that belonged to a woman who had rented the farmhouse legitimately from the actual owner, an elderly man in another state who managed the property through an agency and had limited direct involvement. The woman who ran the listing had been the sole point of contact for every guest, had handled all communications, had maintained the property, had written those breezy responses about old pipes and original plumbing with full knowledge of what was behind the east wall. The concealed space had been in active use for at least 18 months. That estimate came from the physical evidence, the wear on the mattress, the accumulation of personal items, the layering of different food packaging across what appeared to be multiple extended stays. The outlet wired into the wall was not a professional installation, but it was a competent one, drawing power from the bedroom circuit on the other side, which is why no external modification to the electrical panel had ever flagged anything. The hole in the wall had been cut from the inside of the concealed space. Ferreira hadn't confirmed it that morning in the driveway, but I had already known, and the confirmation, when it finally came, didn't produce the shock you might expect. It produced something quieter and more lasting, a cold, settled understanding that rearranged certain things permanently. Someone had lain in that dark space and pressed a tool through the drywall, slowly and carefully, and created a window into a room where strangers slept. had maintained that window, had kept a heavy dresser positioned precisely to conceal it from casual inspection while leaving just enough of a gap for the smell to seep through and for light to enter from the other side. 3 years of guests, 60-something reviews, 4.8 stars. No one was ever charged. The person who had been using the space was identified as a person of interest and never located. The woman running the listing cooperated partially with investigators and then stopped cooperating, and the case moved through a legal process I was not central to and was not kept fully informed about. And somewhere in that process it went quiet in the way cases go quiet when the evidence is strong enough to be disturbing but not strong enough to close. The listing was taken down. I know because I checked. I checked the other platform too, and the one after that. I still check, occasionally, not often, but when I'm booking somewhere new, which I do because I refuse to let this be the thing that makes me smaller, I read every review, every single one. I look for the phrases that repeat across different guests in different seasons. I look for the host's responses, the consistency of them, the particular smoothness of an explanation offered too many times to too many people. I look for the smell comments. I look for the guests who mentioned something and were gently redirected and went home without pushing further. And I never, ever book a room with a heavy piece of furniture flush against an interior wall. I know how that sounds. I know it's the kind of thing that gets filed under "she's still not over it," and maybe that's true, and maybe that's fine, because some experiences don't leave you where they found you, and pretending otherwise is its own kind of damage. My therapist, the same one who told me to go somewhere quiet, said something in one of our sessions after all this that I've turned over many times since. She said the most unsettling part of this kind of violation isn't the danger itself. It's the retroactive reordering, the way it reaches backward through time and changes the quality of things that felt safe in the moment they were happening. She wasn't wrong. I think about the first night most. The fire, the wine, the book I wasn't reading, the genuine rest I had felt settling into me for the first time in months. That feeling was real. I was not wrong to feel it. I just didn't know what was on the other side of the wall. The passenger seat in my rental car was fully reclined, damp, and still warm when I picked it up. The thing about traveling alone is that you develop a very precise sense of what belongs to you and what doesn't. You get attuned to it, the particular arrangement of your own bag, the way you always put your boarding pass in the same pocket, the specific disorder of your own space. You notice when something is off because your things have a grammar to them, and a disruption to that grammar registers before your brain has finished processing what it's seeing. I'd been traveling alone for work for 3 years by the time this happened. I was good at it. I noticed things. I noticed this immediately. The rental lot was in Baton Rouge, a Tuesday evening in late September. I'd flown in from Chicago for a week-long consulting project, a manufacturing client 40 minutes outside the city, a rental car, a mid-range hotel, the standard architecture of a working trip. My flight had been delayed 2 hours, which meant it was nearly 8 p.m. by the time I got through the terminal, through the shuttle, through the rental counter where a teenager named Derek had processed my paperwork with the glazed efficiency of someone 4 hours into a 6-hour shift. White Hyundai Sonata, Space C14. Here's your key. Have a good one. C14 was at the far end of the lot. I walked it in the thick Louisiana September heat, still in the 80s at 8 p.m., the air wet enough to wear, dragging my carry-on over asphalt, key fob in hand. I hit unlock when I was close enough to see the car respond. I opened the driver's door, reached in to put my bag on the passenger seat, and stopped. The passenger seat was fully reclined. Not halfway, not slightly tilted back the way someone might leave it after adjusting it accidentally. Fully reclined, laid back to its maximum position, flat as a bed, the way you'd set it if you were planning to sleep in it. I stood there with my bag hanging in my hand and looked at it, and my first thought was simple and practical. The previous renter had left it this way. Inconsiderate, but not unusual. People were careless with rental cars in the way they were careless with things that didn't belong to them. I leaned across to bring it upright, and my hand came down on the seat fabric. It was damp, not soaked, not wet in the way of a spill. Damp the way fabric gets when it's been in contact with a person for a long time in humid heat. The particular clinging dampness of human warmth. And the seat was warm beneath it. Not the hot plastic warmth of a car that's been sitting in a September parking lot all day. That's a different heat, dry and radiating, stored in the surfaces. This was underneath the surface. The deep, body temperature warmth of recent occupation. Someone had been lying in that seat. Recently, very recently. I straightened up and stood outside the car and looked at the lot around me. It was mostly empty this far from the entrance. A few other vehicles, pools of yellow light from the overhead lamps, the low, distant noise of the terminal. Nothing moving, nobody visible in any direction. I called the rental counter from the lot. Derek answered on the fourth ring, and I told him as calmly as I could that the passenger seat of C-14 was reclined and damp and warm, and that I wanted to know when this car had last been driven. He put me on hold for 3 minutes. When he came back, he said the vehicle had been returned that afternoon around noon, and had been sitting in the lot since. Cleaned and processed at 2 p.m. 6 hours, I said. The car had been sitting empty for 6 hours. Yes, he said. Is everything okay with the vehicle? I looked at the seat, still warm against my hand when I tested it again, still that awful, intimate warmth that had no business being there. I told him the seat was damaged, and I needed a different car. He sighed, the specific sigh of a teenager who had been hoping to coast to the end of his shift without complications, and told me to come back to the counter. I did not get back in the car to drive it to the counter. I walked the length of the lot with my carry-on behind me and did not look back until I was in the fluorescent safety of the rental building, and even then, I'm not sure why I looked back. I think I was checking whether the seat was still reclined. It was. I could see it from 50 yards away. The pale shape of the headrest tilted back at that wrong angle, visible through the windshield in the yellow lot light like something waiting for the weight of a body to return to it. Derek gave me a silver Ford. Different row, different slot. Driver's seat upright and dry and temperature neutral the way a car seat is supposed to be when it hasn't been touched. I sat in it for a moment before I started the engine, hands on the wheel, air conditioning coming up from cold. I told myself it was over. Wrong car, new car, move on. But I've replayed that moment of my hand touching that seat more times than I can count, trying to find the version of it that makes sense. The version where 6 hours of September heat and an empty parking lot produce that specific warmth in that specific fabric in that specific shape of a reclining human body. I haven't found it yet. I don't think I'm going to. The hotel was a Hampton Inn 12 minutes from the client site, the kind of property I'd stayed in enough times that I could navigate it half asleep, which, after a delayed flight and a parking lot I was trying not to think about, was approximately the state I was in. I got to my room, ordered food I barely tasted, and was in bed by 10 with the intention of putting the whole thing behind me. I'm a practical person. I work in operations consulting, which means I spend my professional life finding inefficiencies in systems and fixing them, locating the broken process, the human error, the gap between how something is supposed to work and how it actually does. I'm good at it because I don't catastrophize. I follow the evidence to its most probable conclusion, and I stop there. I don't invent problems beyond the available data. The available data was a car seat that was damp and warm in ways that were difficult to explain. That was all. I had gotten a different car. The situation was resolved. I believed that for about 36 hours. The client site was a manufacturing plant on the western edge of the parish, sprawling, loud, the kind of place that swallowed you whole from 8 in the morning until 6 at night, and left you too tired for anything except dinner and sleep. I drove the silver Ford out and back both days, and it was entirely neutral, entirely unremarkable, the benign, anonymous machine a rental car is supposed to be. I started to feel the shape of the previous evening softening at the edges, the way unsettling things do when ordinary life presses up against them from all sides. On Thursday morning, I stopped for gas at a station off the highway. While the tank filled, I walked around the car out of habit, checking tires, the kind of automatic physical survey you develop after years of rentals in unfamiliar places where you're responsible for damage you didn't cause. I checked the front, the driver's side, the rear. The passenger seat was reclined, not fully, not laid flat the way it had been in the Hyundai, halfway, tilted back at an angle that was unmistakably deliberate, the kind of position you'd settle into for a long drive. I stood at the passenger window and looked at it through the glass and felt the gas pump click off behind me and didn't move for a moment. I thought about when I had last looked at that seat. The night I'd picked up the car, I'd confirmed it was upright, I'd checked. I had specifically checked because I was already primed to notice. I had driven it alone for 2 days. I had not reclined it. I had no reason to recline it and no memory of doing so, and no point in the past 48 hours where I had been anything other than alone in that vehicle. I brought the seat upright, stood there with my hand on the lever a moment longer than necessary, dry, completely dry, and the temperature of the air around it. No warmth, no dampness, nothing of what I'd felt in the Hyundai 2 nights ago. Just fabric and foam and the neutral indifference of an inanimate object. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, got back in the driver's seat, and pulled onto the highway. Coincidence, I told myself. I'd bumped it somehow, getting in, getting out, a bag catching the lever. It happened. I didn't believe it, but I let myself act like I did because acting like I did got me through the day. That night I called the rental company's customer service line from my hotel room. Not Derek's direct counter, the national line, the one staffed by people with access to the full fleet database. I told the representative I'd had a concern with an original vehicle assigned to me at the Baton Rouge location, Space C-14, and asked whether they had any record of incidents or complaints associated with it. She put me on hold, came back, said there were no open complaints on the vehicle and that it had been inspected and processed normally on return that afternoon. That afternoon. The car is still in service? I asked. It was reassigned this afternoon, yes. Is there a specific concern I can note? I thought about how to phrase it. A seat that was warm when it shouldn't have been warm. An upholstery dampness with no source. The shape of recent human occupation in a car that had been sitting empty for 6 hours. I think someone may have been in the vehicle while it was sitting in the lot, I said. Between when it was processed and when I picked it up. A pause. I can flag it for a security review if you'd like. Please, I said. She flagged it, gave me a reference number, wished me a pleasant stay. I hung up and sat on the edge of the hotel bed and thought about what she'd said, reassigned this afternoon, and about whoever was driving the Hyundai right now, whether they'd noticed anything, whether they'd put their hand on the passenger seat and felt something wrong in it, or whether whatever had been in that car had moved on by now. Whether moved on was even the right concept for what I was dealing with. I went to the window and looked out at the parking lot below. The silver Ford was in space 14, 2 rows back from the entrance, under a lamp that gave everything a yellow tinge. From this angle I could see the passenger side clearly through the windshield. The seat was upright. I watched it for longer than made any sense. Nothing moved. The lot was still and empty, and the car sat in its space with the complete, inanimate patience of a machine, and I stood at my window watching it until I felt sufficiently foolish to stop. I left the curtain open when I went to bed. I told myself it was because I liked the light. It wasn't because of the light. Friday was my last full day at the client site, and I spent most of it on autopilot, walking the floor, documenting processes, asking the questions I was being paid to ask, while a separate part of my brain ran its own parallel investigation that had nothing to do with manufacturing inefficiencies. I'm good at research. It's the core of what I do. Pulling information from systems, finding the thread that connects disparate data points into a coherent picture. I'd been resisting applying that skill to the rental car situation because some part of me understood that coherent pictures are not always ones you want to have. But by Friday afternoon, I'd run out of ways to not think about it, and I pulled out my phone during a break and started looking. The Baton Rouge rental lot had a physical address. From the address, I found the property management company and from there, a local business database that listed incident reports associated with commercial properties, the same public record search Pat Delgado had shown Marcus how to run, though I didn't know that at the time and wouldn't have found the comparison comforting if I had. The lot had 2 incident reports in the past 4 years, a fender collision between 2 vehicles being moved by lot staff in 2022, minor damage, no injuries, and a police welfare check in August of this year, 7 weeks ago, called in by a rental counter employee who had noticed a vehicle in the long-term section of the lot with its engine running and the windows fogged and had gone to investigate. The report was brief. The vehicle, a white Hyundai Sonata, the make and color logged in the responding officer's notes, had been found with a male occupant in the passenger seat, reclined, unresponsive. The man had been transported to a nearby hospital. The report listed his status at time of transport as critical. There was no follow-up report attached. I sat in my rental car in the client site parking lot and read that 3 times. White Hyundai Sonata, passenger seat, reclined. I thought about the lot's layout, the long-term section at the far end, away from the main entrance, poorly lit, the kind of corner a car could sit in for a while before anyone noticed. I thought about Derek telling me the vehicle had been returned at noon and processed at 2 and sitting in the lot for 6 hours before I picked it up at 8. I thought about how much of the afternoon those 6 hours covered and whether any part of them had overlapped with whatever had happened in that car 7 weeks before I ever set foot in Baton Rouge. I called the rental company's national line again. Different representative this time, a man with a patient voice who listened to my reference number and pulled up my flagged complaint and asked how he could help. I told him I wanted to know the service history of the Hyundai from Space C-14, specifically whether it had been involved in a police welfare check in August. A long pause. I'm not going to be able to share incident history on specific fleet vehicles, sir. I'm not asking for details, I said. I'm asking whether you're aware of an incident involving that vehicle. Another pause, different in quality from the first, the pause of someone deciding something. I can tell you that the vehicle you're referencing has been flagged for retirement from the fleet, he said carefully. It's been taken out of service. When? As of today. As of today. The same day, it had apparently been reassigned to a new renter. The customer service representative the previous night had said reassigned that afternoon. I thought about that new renter, about whether they'd noticed anything when they picked it up, whether they'd gone to put something on the passenger seat and found it occupied by a warmth that had no right to be there. I gave the representative my reference number again and asked him to add a note. He said he would. I didn't ask what the note would accomplish. That evening I drove back to the hotel and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going in, which had become a habit I didn't examine too closely. The September heat had broken slightly, a front moving through, the air looser and cooler than it had been all week, a distant suggestion of rain somewhere to the west. I sat with the windows down and thought about a man lying in a reclined passenger seat in a poorly lit corner of a rental lot and what that meant, what it said about the hours he'd spent there, whether he'd chosen that particular car for a particular reason or whether it had been the nearest available space and the seat had simply reclined all the way because he'd needed it to, whether he had survived. I didn't know that. The report had said critical and nothing after. I got out of the car and was halfway to the hotel entrance when I stopped. The silver Ford was parked where I'd left it, facing the hotel, passenger side visible from where I stood. I could see through the windshield clearly in the overhead light. The passenger seat was reclined again. Not halfway this time, all the way. Laid flat to its maximum position, the same angle, the same deliberate horizontal that I'd found in the Hyundai on Tuesday evening. I stood in the parking lot with my laptop bag over my shoulder and looked at it and felt the specific quality of cold that has nothing to do with temperature. The front coming through had dropped things by 10 degrees, but that wasn't what I was feeling. I walked to the passenger door, opened it. The seat was warm, same warmth, same depth of it, not surface heat, not stored solar warmth, not anything the material of the seat should have been capable of producing on its own after a day of sitting empty. The same body temperature intimacy I had felt on Tuesday in a different car in a different space, and told myself I'd left behind when I handed back the key. I stood there, with my hand flat on the warm reclined seat, and understood that I had not left anything behind at all. I had simply brought it with me. I stood at that open passenger door for a long time. The parking lot was quiet around me, a couple walking toward the hotel entrance 50 yards away, the distant percussion of a truck on the highway, the first few drops of the promised rain beginning to spot the asphalt. Ordinary Thursday evening sounds. The world entirely indifferent to the fact that I was standing next to a car that shouldn't be warm and was hand-pressed flat to the seat, feeling the heat of a body that wasn't there. I want to tell you I handled it well. I didn't. I shut the passenger door. I walked around to the driver's side, got in, and just sat there behind the wheel with the engine off and my laptop bag in my lap like a shield. My hands weren't shaking. They were very still, which felt worse somehow, like my body had moved past the trembling stage into something quieter and more serious. I sat there for probably 10 minutes doing nothing except breathing and staring at the hotel entrance and not looking at the passenger seat. Then I looked at the passenger seat, still reclined, still carrying that warmth I could feel from 12 inches away without touching it, a gentle radiant heat, almost body temperature, the kind of warmth that a person leaves behind in a chair after they've been sitting in it for hours. Except there was no person. The seat was empty in every visible, verifiable, physical sense of the word. And yet, I thought about what I knew. An operations consultant's inventory of facts laid out in order. A man found unresponsive in the passenger seat of a white Hyundai Sonata, same make and color as C14, in the long-term section of this rental lot 7 weeks ago. Status critical, no follow-up. A seat that had been warm and damp when I first touched it on Tuesday, 6 hours after the car had supposedly been sitting empty. A different car, same seat, same warmth. Twice now, with no explanation that held up to even casual scrutiny. And the common denominator in all of it was not the car. It was the seat, the passenger seat, someone who had needed to lie down. I thought about what it means to be in a place when the worst thing happens, whether the worst thing leaves something of you there, some residue of the body's last significant effort pressed into the fabric the way heat is pressed into a seat. Whether that something, unmoored from everything that had kept it coherent, might drift toward the nearest available version of the shape it remembered. A passenger seat, reclined, someone in it. I thought about the man in the welfare check report. Whether he'd chosen that car deliberately or whether it had been random. Whether he'd lain in that reclined seat for a long time before anyone noticed, the engine running, the windows fogging. Whether whatever happened to him in that car had finished, or whether it had simply paused. I got out. I stood beside the car in the beginning rain and called the hospital. I'm not sure what I expected. They weren't going to give me patient information. I knew that going in. I told the woman who answered that I was trying to get information about a patient brought in from a rental car lot on a specific date in August that I had reason to believe I might know who it was. She was professional and genuinely apologetic and told me she couldn't confirm or deny patient admissions. I asked whether there was a way to flag that someone was trying to reach a patient by that description. She said she could pass a message to patient liaisons if I left my name and number. I left them. She thanked me. I hung up and stood in the rain, the thing I kept returning to, standing there getting wet in a Hampton Inn parking lot in Baton Rouge on a Friday evening, was the warmth. Not the fear of it. I was past the fear by then, or past the sharp edge of it, worn down into something duller and more persistent. What I kept returning to was its quality. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't threatening in the way of something that wants to harm you. It was patient, gentle almost. The warmth of someone lying down because they had to, because something in them had needed rest, and finding in the nearest available horizontal space a way to keep doing the only thing left available to do. I went back to the passenger door and opened it again. The seat was still warm, still reclined. The rain was coming down properly now, drumming on the roof of the car, filling the parking lot with white noise, running in lines down the windows. I reached in and brought the seat upright, slowly, deliberately, all the way forward to its full position. Then I took my jacket from the back seat and folded it carefully and laid it on the passenger seat, not draped, not dropped, placed, the way you'd put a blanket on someone who had fallen asleep somewhere uncomfortable. I don't know why I did that. I'm not sure I could explain it to anyone in terms that would survive scrutiny. It was the same instinct that makes you speak quietly in a place where someone is resting. A courtesy extended to something I couldn't see toward a situation I couldn't fully understand. I closed the door, went inside, got into the shower and stood under hot water until the room was full of steam and my skin had stopped feeling like the outside world was still on it. I checked the car before bed, passenger seat upright, jacket still where I'd placed it. No warmth that I could detect, or maybe I just couldn't bring myself to press my hand to it a fourth time to find out. In the morning, 30 minutes before my flight, I returned to the Ford at the lot. The same entrance, different staff. I pulled into the return lane and a young woman in a reflective vest walked around the car with her tablet doing the condition check, noting mileage and fuel level and the absence of new damage. She paused at the passenger door, opened it, looked at the folded jacket on the seat, and then at me. "Is this yours?" "Yes," I said. I took it from her. Under the jacket, the seat was upright and dry and entirely neutral. She made a note on her tablet, handed me my receipt, and wished me a safe flight. I walked into the terminal and didn't look back at the lot. But in the gate area, waiting to board, I sat down in a row of chairs and became aware of something I couldn't immediately account for. A warmth on my right side, faint but present, coming from the empty seat beside me. I looked at it. Standard airport seating, blue upholstered, nobody in it, nobody recently in it that I'd seen. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I put my jacket on the empty seat, the same way I had the night before, and I opened my book and I read, and I did not look at the seat again until my boarding group was called. The jacket was warm when I picked it up. I've been home for 5 weeks. Home is a 1-bedroom apartment in Chicago, 3rd floor, north-facing, the kind of place that gets cold early in fall and stays cold until April. I've lived there for 2 years. I know it well enough that I navigate it in the dark without thinking, know exactly which floorboard creaks near the bathroom door, know the specific sound the radiator makes when the building's boiler kicks on for the first time each winter. It's a known space, a controlled space. The kind of place a person who works in systems and efficiency chooses deliberately because it has no surprises. It has surprises now, nothing dramatic. I want to be clear about that. I'm not describing a haunting in the classical sense, nothing that moves through rooms or speaks or makes itself visible in ways I can photograph or document. What I'm describing is subtler than that, and in some ways harder to live with because of its subtlety. It's the passenger seat of my own car, sitting at a slightly different angle than I left it. It's the chair at my kitchen table, pulled out an inch from where I pushed it in. It's the particular quality of warmth on the right side of the couch when I come home after a long day. Not room temperature, not radiator warmth, not the warmth of a cushion that's been in afternoon sun, the other kind. I've stopped testing it with my hand. That lasted about a week before I understood that confirming it repeatedly wasn't helping me and wasn't serving any purpose I could identify. It's there or it isn't, and my hand on the seat doesn't change either answer. I called the hospital again from Chicago. Different approach. I found the patient liaison department directly and explained that I had information potentially related to a patient admitted in August from a rental car lot, that I wasn't family but that I had been in contact with. I paused here, picked my word carefully, the situation, and that I wanted to know whether the patient had survived. The liaison I spoke to was a woman who had the careful, practiced warmth of someone accustomed to delivering information to people who were braced for it. She told me she couldn't confirm patient identity or status to non-family members. I thanked her, and we were almost done when she said, quietly, almost as an afterthought, "If you have reason to believe someone is trying to reach a family member, You could try going through public records. Obituaries are public. She said it gently, the way you say something gently when the answer is already in the room and you're just pointing at it. I found it in 20 minutes. A local paper from a town 3 states away, dated 4 weeks after the welfare check report. Gerald Maurer, 61 years old. Survived by a sister and 2 adult children. Worked for 30 years in freight logistics. The obituary was brief and kind and said nothing about the manner of his death and everything necessary about the shape of his life. A man who had worked hard, who had been loved by a specific small number of people, who had spent 30 years moving things from one place to another and had ended, finally, in a rental car in a lot in Baton Rouge, with the passenger seat reclined, because that was the last comfortable position available to him. I read it twice, noted his name, said it out loud in my apartment, the way I'd said Lily Marsden's name in my head when I'd read her obituary, a private acknowledgement of a person who had existed and mattered and was now being held in the record of a stranger's unsettling week in Louisiana. Gerald Maurer, 61 years old, freight logistics. I thought about him choosing that rental car in a long-term lot instead of somewhere else, whether there had been intention in it or whether it had simply been where he ended up, the nearest available space when whatever had been building for a long time finally arrived. I thought about the seat fully reclined, the windows fogging, the engine running so it would stay warm. I thought about a rental company employee noticing and calling it in, and whether that call had been too late, and what the hours before it had been like for him lying in that passenger seat in the corner of a lot that nobody was watching. And then I thought about the warmth transferring to me, about what that meant, whether he'd had somewhere to go and had simply taken what was available when I touched that seat, or whether he'd been as surprised by it as I was, 2 strangers connected by the brief warmth of an upholstered surface on a Tuesday evening in September. I don't know. I've turned it over enough times now that the edges are worn smooth, and I'm no longer sure I'm thinking about it clearly. What I know is that something came home with me from Baton Rouge and has been occupying the right side of my spaces ever since. The passenger seat, the kitchen chair, the couch cushion, with the quiet, undemanding persistence of something that has nowhere else particular to be. It doesn't frighten me the way it did in the parking lot. I'm not sure that's wisdom or just exhaustion, the way you stop flinching at a sound after you've heard it enough times. But it's there, and it's consistent, and I've made an uneasy peace with its consistency the way you make peace with things you cannot change. I leave the passenger seat of my car adjusted slightly back now. Not reclined. I'm not prepared for that, but not fully upright either. Somewhere in between, a position nobody would notice unless they were looking for it. I don't know why I do it. It feels like the same instinct as the folded jacket on the seat, the same reflex toward courtesy that I don't have a rational framework for, but that has become part of how I move through my own spaces now. My colleague Dana, not her real name, asked me recently why I'd started taking the train to work instead of driving. I told her parking had gotten expensive. She accepted that because it was partially true, and because the full truth is not a thing I've found a way to say out loud to anyone who wasn't there. The full truth is that I drive alone less than I used to, that when I do drive, I keep both hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road, and I don't look at the passenger seat unless I have to. Because some mornings, when the angle of the light is right and the seat is sitting the way I've left it, adjusted back just slightly, I can almost see the shape of someone in it. And some mornings, before I've fully talked myself out of it, I almost don't mind. Gerald Maurer, 61 years old, 30 years moving things from one place to another. Still going, I think. Just differently now.
My toddler waves at the same corner of her room every night at exactly the same time. The nanny cam shows nothing there. I'm the person people call when they need something explained. That's not arrogance. It's just always been true. I'm a structural engineer by trade, which means I spend my days looking at things other people find mysterious or alarming and reducing them to their component parts. A crack in a foundation wall, a beam that shifts under load, a building that doesn't behave the way it should. There is always an explanation. There is always a cause. My entire professional life is built on the understanding that the physical world follows rules, and that if something appears to break those rules, you haven't found the right angle yet. My wife Danny would tell you that this makes me insufferable to live with. She is not entirely wrong. So when she started mentioning the waving, casually at first, over dinner, in that careful tone she uses when she knows I'm going to push back, I did exactly what she expected me to do. I nodded, I asked a few questions, I offered 4 or 5 reasonable explanations, and I moved on. Toddlers wave at things. Wren was 18 months old and had recently discovered that waving produced enthusiastic responses from every adult in her life, and had therefore begun waving at furniture, at windows, at the dog's water bowl. She waved at the vacuum cleaner with genuine affection. The idea that she was waving at a specific corner of her room at a specific time every night was something I filed under pattern recognition bias. Danny was watching the nanny cam footage at random intervals, and her brain was doing what brains do, stitching coincidences into meaning. I said this gently and with love. Danny gave me the look she reserves for moments when she is certain she is right and is choosing to wait me out. We'd moved into the house 4 months earlier, a 1960s split level in a neighborhood that had aged unevenly. Some houses maintained to the point of renovation vanity, others left to quietly accumulate decades. Ours was somewhere in the middle. Good bones, as the listing had said, which in real estate is a polite way of noting that the cosmetics needed work, but the structure was sound. That part, at least, I'd verified myself. The bones were fine. Wren's room was at the end of the upstairs hallway, northeast corner of the house. We'd painted it a soft yellow, assembled the crib ourselves on a Saturday afternoon with the windows open, hung little paper stars from the ceiling that turned slowly in the draft from the vent. It was a good room. It smelled like fresh paint and the cedar of her dresser, and faintly, in damp weather, like the old house underneath all our renovations. The nanny cam sat on the dresser, angled to cover the crib and most of the room. Motion activated, night vision capable. The footage synced to an app on both our phones. Danny checked it more than I did. That was how she'd noticed it first, scrolling back through overnight footage on a Sunday morning while I made coffee, going quiet in a way that made me turn around. "Come look at this," she said. I looked. Wren was sitting up in her crib, 11:47 p.m. on the timestamp, facing the northeast corner of the room, the corner with nothing in it. And she was waving. A slow, deliberate wave, the kind you'd give someone across a room. Not frantic, not playful, calm and certain, the way you wave at someone you know. I watched the clip 3 times. Then I handed Danny's phone back and told her it was probably a shadow or a light reflection from outside, or the way the night vision rendered movement in the curtain. That was on a Sunday. By Wednesday, I'd watched the footage from the previous 11 nights. 11 nights. 11 timestamps. The spread across those timestamps was less than 4 minutes, and 8 of the 11 were exactly, precisely, 11:47 p.m. I didn't tell Danny that part. Not yet. I sat with it alone in my home office at midnight, with the app open on my laptop, the clips lined up in a row, and I went looking, very methodically, the way I approach everything, for the explanation that was definitely there. I'm still looking. The first thing I ruled out was light interference. Our street has 2 amber sodium lamps, and I mapped their angles against Wren's window at night with the same precision I'd use on a site assessment. Neither one reaches the northeast corner at the right trajectory. The curtains are blackout. We'd bought them specifically to keep the room dark for her sleep. And even with them open, which they never are at night, the geometry doesn't produce a reflection that would land in that corner at floor level, which is where Wren's gaze was consistently directed. Not the wall, not the ceiling, the floor of the corner, around 18 inches up at most. I ruled out the vent next. There's a floor register in the northeast corner, original to the house, and I spent an evening watching what the airflow does to the lightweight objects in that room. The paper stars above the crib, a small fabric mobile, a piece of tissue I placed deliberately near the register. The movement was inconsistent and directional, nothing that would produce a visual stimulus at the same time every night. I rechecked the HVAC schedule on the thermostat. The system cycles on a programmable timer, but the cycle nearest to 11:47 p.m. runs at 11:30, and the register in question is on the return line, not the supply. Cooled air in, not out. I know how this reads. I know it sounds like a man building an elaborate case to avoid the conclusion he doesn't want to reach. Danny said something close to that, carefully, one evening when she found me cross-referencing the cam footage with the thermostat logs. She wasn't wrong. But here's the thing about being someone who believes in explanations. You can't stop looking for them just because they're not where you expected. You look harder. You look longer. You look in every corner you can think of before you accept that you've run out of corners. I hadn't run out yet, but the list was getting shorter. It was my mother-in-law who introduced the variable I'd been successfully avoiding. She came to visit on a Thursday, 3 weeks into my quiet investigation, and she was in Wren's room for maybe 10 minutes before she came back downstairs with an expression I couldn't immediately read. Not alarmed, thoughtful. The way someone looks when they're deciding how much to say. "That's a cold room," she said. "The insulation in the exterior walls is original," I told her. "It's on my list." She looked at me for a moment. "That's not what I mean. Her name is Lorraine, and she is not a superstitious woman. She's a retired school principal who ran a district of 4,000 students for 12 years and has the disposition of someone who has heard every possible excuse and is not in the business of indulging nonsense. Which is part of why what she said next landed differently than it would have from someone else. "Has Wren always done well in that room?" she asked. "Sleeping, I mean. Has she always been settled in there?" I started to say yes, and then I stopped. Because the honest answer was more complicated than yes. Wren had never been a difficult sleeper in the clinical sense. She went down on schedule. She didn't fight bedtime. She didn't wake screaming. But there was something I'd catalogued and set aside without examining too closely. In the 4 months we'd lived in this house, she had never once slept past 11:50 p.m. without waking. Not once. She'd sleep soundly from 7 until sometime between 11:43 and 11:52, at which point she'd sit up, alert, oriented, not crying, not distressed, and then eventually lie back down and sleep through until morning. We'd assumed it was a sleep cycle thing, a developmental phase. I said this to Lorraine. She nodded slowly, the way she does when she's listening to something and finding it significant for reasons she hasn't shared yet. "When did you say you moved in?" she asked. "February, the 14th. "And before you, did you know the house at all? Did you know who lived here?" I told her we'd bought from an estate. The previous owner had died, an older man, a widower, lived alone for the last several years. No children still in the area. The estate sale had cleared most of the contents before we took possession. Lorraine was quiet for a moment. "What corner of the room does she wave at?" she said. Something moved through me that I didn't have a name for. A structural engineer's version of a chill, maybe. The specific sensation of identifying a load-bearing element you'd previously miscalculated. "Northeast," I said. "Why?" She set down her tea. "Because that's where the bed would have been," she said. "In a room that size, in a house this age, that's where you put the bed. The warmest corner in winter, away from the window drafts." She looked at me steadily. "That's where an old man would have slept for 30 years. The house was very quiet around us. Upstairs, through the baby monitor on the kitchen counter, I could hear Wren breathing in the even, untroubled rhythm of afternoon sleep. I didn't say anything. There was nothing in my professional vocabulary for what Lorraine had just suggested. and nothing in my personal vocabulary either. And so I sat there with my untouched coffee and looked at the monitor and listened to my daughter breathe and felt, for the first time since this started, the specific discomfort of a man who has run the numbers and doesn't like what they're telling him. That night, I set the nanny cam to continuous record. I told myself it was for data purposes. I needed more footage, a larger sample, better resolution on exactly where her gaze was directed. That was all. That was the only reason. I checked the footage at 11:52 p.m. from my phone in bed. 11:47, same as always. Wren sitting up, facing the corner, one small hand raised in that slow and certain wave. 8 seconds of it. Then she lowered her hand, settled back against the mattress, and closed her eyes. I watched it 4 times, the way I had the first clip. And on the 4th pass, I finally made myself look at what I'd been looking past for 3 weeks. Not at Wren, not at the corner, but at the room around them, at the quality of her attention, at the absolute stillness of a child who is not waving at shadows or vents or the product of a developing brain's pattern noise. She was waving at something. The unhurried, comfortable certainty of it was the most frightening thing I had ever seen. I told Danny the next morning. Not everything. Not the thermostat logs or the light angle calculations or the 17 clips I'd catalogued by timestamp in a spreadsheet that I'd titled, with grim irony, Wren's Sleep Anomalies. Just the essential facts. 11 nights confirmed, the timestamps clustering tightly around 11:47, and what Lorraine had said about the corner. She listened without interrupting, which is not her default mode, which told me she'd been waiting for me to get here. "I've been watching it for 6 weeks," she said. "I know." "You told me it was pattern recognition bias." "I know." She didn't say, "I told you so." She's not built that way. She just looked at me across the kitchen table with the careful patience of someone who has been frightened alone for a month and a half, and is relieved, at least, to no longer be frightened alone. That was almost worse than anger would have been. "So what do we do?" she said. I told her I wanted to find out more about the previous owner first. Something concrete, something I could actually hold. Because as much as Lorraine's observation about the bed corner had settled into me like a splinter, I was not ready, professionally, constitutionally, to accept "old man used to sleep there" as a meaningful data point. People sleep in corners. Houses have histories. I needed something specific before I was willing to take the next step in whatever direction this was going. The estate attorney's name was in the closing paperwork. I called him on a Friday afternoon, introduced myself as the new owner, following up on a minor title question, and then, less smoothly than I'd intended, asked about the man who'd lived there. His name had been Gerald Marsh, 78 years old, widower since 2019, when his wife of 41 years had died after a short illness. No children. Had lived in the house since 1987. The estate had been administered by a nephew in another state who hadn't visited in several years and had been primarily interested in a clean, quick sale. I asked, as casually as I could manage, whether Gerald had died in the house. A pause. "He did," the attorney said. "In his sleep. Very peaceful, from what we understand." I thanked him. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while after hanging up. 41 years in that house. 35 of them presumably sleeping in the northeast corner of what was now my daughter's room, in the spot Lorraine had identified without ever being told. A man who had outlived his wife by 4 years and spent those 4 years alone in these rooms, in this quiet, until one night he simply didn't wake up. I'm not a sentimental person. I don't believe in things I can't measure. But I sat in my home office that afternoon listening to the late October rain moving across the roof in slow sheets, and I thought about Gerald Marsh dying alone in the corner of a room that now belonged to my 18-month-old daughter, and I felt something shift in me. Not belief, exactly, more like the structural engineer's acknowledgement that a load exists even before you've identified what's carrying it. Something was in that corner. Whether it was Gerald Marsh or grief, or the particular atmospheric density of a life lived long in one place, I couldn't tell you. But something had been there every night at 11:47, and my daughter had been waving at it for at least 6 weeks, and she had never once seemed afraid. That last part was the thing I kept returning to. She wasn't afraid. In every clip, every timestamp, every 8 seconds of slow, deliberate waving, Wren looked exactly the way she looked when she waved at our neighbor across the fence, or at her grandmother through the car window. Comfortable, recognized, like she was greeting someone she expected to see. I told myself this was reassuring. Some nights it almost was. Then the footage changed. It was a Tuesday, 5 days after my conversation with the estate attorney. I was in bed, Danny already asleep beside me, rain tapping steadily against the window, and I had my phone face up on the nightstand with the Nanny Cam app open the way I'd taken to doing. Not watching actively, just keeping it accessible. Danny had asked me to stop doing this. She said it was making it worse. She was probably right. 11:47 came and went. I watched Wren sit up, watched her face the corner, watched the small hand rise, and then I sat up too, because Wren had stopped waving. She was still facing the corner, still sitting upright with that eerie, focused attention she brought to this every single night. But her arm was down. Both arms were down. She was just sitting there, very still, staring. The clip ran for 22 seconds. Wren didn't move, didn't wave, didn't lie back down. She just stared into the corner with an expression I couldn't fully read on the small screen. Something concentrated and intent, the way a child looks when they're listening carefully to something just beyond the threshold of what the adults around them can hear. Then she did something she had never done before. She reached out. Both arms extended toward the corner, the universal gesture of a toddler who wants to be picked up. Hands open, fingers spread, leaning slightly forward over the crib rail, with the complete physical confidence of a child who is absolutely certain that what they're reaching for is going to catch them. My mouth went dry. I was out of bed before I'd made any conscious decision to move. Down the hallway, in the dark, the rain loud against the roof now, hitting the skylight above the stairs with that heavy, insistent drumming that makes the whole house feel smaller and closer than it is. I didn't run. I don't know why, some instinct toward not making noise, not disturbing whatever equilibrium existed in that room. But I moved fast, one hand on the wall, eyes adjusting to the dark. I pushed open Wren's door. She was sitting in the crib, arms still extended toward the corner, perfectly balanced, perfectly still. I crossed the room. I stepped between her and the corner without thinking, the way you step between your child and a street. Turned my back to it, picked her up. She was warm and solid and smelled like sleep. And she made the small, indignant sound she makes when her routine is interrupted. For one surreal moment, I just stood there, holding my daughter in the dark room in the rain, my back to the northeast corner, every nerve in my body quietly insisting that I not turn around. So I didn't. I carried her out of the room, pulled the door shut behind me, and stood in the hallway under the low yellow glow of the nightlight, with Wren on my shoulder, and my heart doing something irregular and loud behind my ribs. She was asleep again inside of 2 minutes. I stood there for considerably longer than that. Danny found me in the hallway at 12:20 a.m. She'd woken to the empty space beside her and followed the nightlight, and she stood in the doorway of our bedroom in her socks, looking at me with Wren slack and sleeping on my shoulder, and didn't ask any questions. Just looked at my face and read whatever she found there. "Show me," she said quietly. I pulled up the clip on my phone, held it so we could both watch. Wren sitting up, the stillness where the waving used to be, and then the arms going out,
Open hands, absolute certainty, leaning toward something in the corner with the full, unguarded trust of a child who has never once been dropped. Danny watched it twice. Then she looked up at me, and I could see her doing the same thing I'd been doing for weeks. The same internal negotiation between what she wanted to be true and what the footage was showing her. "We need to move her room," she said. "Yes." "Tomorrow." "Yes." We put Wren back down in a crib that night, only because it was nearly midnight and we had nowhere else to immediately put her. And I will be honest with you, neither of us slept. Danny lay beside me, rigid and wakeful, and I stared at the ceiling and watched the MannyCam app. And at 11:47, there was nothing. Wren's crib was empty because we'd brought her in with us. The room was dark and still, and the corner was just a corner. And at 11:48, I finally put the phone face down on the nightstand and closed my eyes. We moved her to the small room across the hall the next day. It had been a home office for Gerald Marsh, according to the estate documents, which I found myself thinking about more than I wanted to. But it was bright and south-facing and entirely without history as far as we could establish, and we repainted it the same soft yellow as the old room, and reassembled the crib by the window, and hung the paper stars, and told ourselves this was just a practical decision about space. For 11 days, Wren slept through the night without waking. 11 nights. I counted them the same way I'd counted the timestamps, with the same obsessive precision. And on the 11th morning, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and allowed myself to feel something close to relief. It was over. Whatever it had been, sleep cycle disruption, environmental stimulus, the particular sensitivity that very young children sometimes have to things adults have learned to tune out, it was over. The new room had broken the pattern. That was all. That was enough. On the 12th night, Wren woke at 11:47. I heard her on the monitor before I was fully conscious. That familiar, alert wakefulness, not crying, just present. Awake and oriented, the way she always was. I reached for my phone. She was sitting up in the new crib, in the new room, facing the south window. Nothing unusual about that. The window was where the light came in, the most visually interesting surface in the room. She was a toddler who'd woken in the night and was looking toward light. Completely normal. I was almost back asleep when the notification came through. Motion detected. Secondary motion, the app called it. Movement below the threshold of the primary alert. The kind produced by a very small or very slow-moving source. I opened the clip. Wren was still facing the window, and she was waving. Not at the window, not at the light or the curtain or anything the window might plausibly contain. Her body was angled toward the window, but her head was turned, sharply and deliberately, toward the left, toward the interior corner of the new room, the southwest corner, the one closest to the hallway, the one that had no history we knew of, the one I had chosen specifically because it had no history. Her hand moved in that slow, familiar arc. I sat up in bed. The wave lasted 6 seconds. Then she turned back toward the window and lay down and closed her eyes. I put my phone face down and pressed both palms flat on the mattress and breathed and tried to think like the structural engineer I am. Load and response, cause and effect. The physical world follows rules, but here is what I couldn't engineer my way around. Whatever Wren was waving at had not been in the northeast corner of her old room. It had followed her. That thought arrived fully formed and sat in my chest like cold water finding its level, and I couldn't drain it out. I couldn't rationalize past it. Because the northeast corner had been explainable as coincidence. Gerald Marsh's corner, his longtime bedroom, a location with a fixed history. But the southwest corner of a repainted office across the hall had no history. No dead man's bed, no 40 years of occupancy,
Nothing that could account for a recurring presence at 11:47 p.m. Nothing except Wren. Whatever this was, whatever she'd been waving at for weeks, it wasn't attached to the room. I got up, walked down the hall, stood outside her door with my hand on the knob for a long moment, listening. Rain on the roof, steady and patient. The same rain that had been cycling through for days. Wren's breathing, even and soft, through the monitor in my pocket. I opened the door. The room was dark. The nightlight threw its low amber wash across the crib, across the new yellow walls, across the south window where rain ran in thin rivulets down the glass. The southwest corner was just a corner. I stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long time. The way you look at something that you know has just moving, but has stopped moving by the time you turned around. That specific, humiliating quality of stillness that is not the same as emptiness. Wren slept. I checked a corner one more time. Then I crossed the room, sat down in the nursing chair beside her crib, and stayed there until morning. Wren is 3 now. She stopped waking at 11:47, about 4 months after the night I sat in that chair. Gradually at first, the timestamps loosening, the gaps between occurrences stretching from nights to weeks to nothing. The last clip I have of her waving is dated March 14th. She's been sleeping clean and uninterrupted ever since, the way toddlers are supposed to sleep, the way I spent almost a year desperately wanting her to sleep. We're still in the house. I want to be clear about that, because people always assume we left. We didn't. The school district is good, and the bones are sound, and Wren loves her room and has no memory, as far as we can tell, as far as any of this is possible to verify, of any of it. She's never mentioned it, never looked at a corner with that particular quality of attention again. As far as she's concerned, she has always simply lived here, and the room has always simply been hers. I've thought a lot about Gerald Marsh. I had no particular reason to think about him as a person before all of this started. He was a line in the closing documents, a category on a death certificate, a set of boot prints in the history of a house. But I know more about him now than I intended to. I know he lived here for 37 years. I know he lost his wife on a Thursday in November, and that the death notice in the local paper described her as his partner in everything. I know he spent the last 4 years of his life alone in these rooms, without children, without her. And I know he died quietly in the corner of what is now Wren's room, on a night that, based on what the attorney told me, would have been very much like this. Cold, raining, the house settling around him in the dark. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know what she offered him. I'm not sure those are the right questions, but here is what I believe. And I say that as someone who has spent his entire professional life treating belief as the thing you resort to when the measurements run out. I think Gerald Marsh was lonely. The particular, accumulated loneliness of a man who had loved someone for 41 years and then had no one left to receive it. And I think that Wren, who at 18 months had no understanding of death or loneliness or the weight a house carries after long occupation, simply saw him. The way children see things before the world teaches them not to. Without fear, without framework, without any of the elaborate apparatus adults build to avoid looking directly at what's there. She waved at him the way she waved at everyone, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I can't explain what changed in March. I don't know if he left or moved on or simply stopped visiting, or if whatever he had needed was, over those months, quietly and completely given. I like to think it was the last one. I like to think that a toddler in yellow pajamas waving goodnight from her crib every evening for 6 months was, for a lonely old man in whatever form he persisted, something like enough. The nanny cam is still on the dresser. I still check it some nights, though less than I used to. The northeast corner is where we put the small white bookshelf last spring. Board books mostly, and a stuffed elephant Wren has named Gerald for reasons she cannot explain, and which she does not find strange at all. Danny noticed the name first. She came and found me in the kitchen and stood in the doorway and looked at me for a long moment without saying anything. "I know," I said. She nodded, went back to what she was doing. "We don't talk about it much. There isn't really anything left to say. The measurements ran out a long time ago, and what remained after them is something I don't have a professional vocabulary for, and have stopped trying to find one. Some loads I've come to understand. You just learn to carry."